The knife slipped from Ren's fingers and clattered against the frozen ground before he even realized he had dropped it. His breath came out in short, silent bursts of white mist, each one disappearing into the gray morning air, like a secret he could never keep. 3 men stood at the edge of the clearing, and every single one of them was looking at him. He had not heard them coming. He never heard anything coming. That was the problem with living in the Deadlands. The silence there was so deep and so complete that it swallowed everything, and Ren had learned, after years of living alone inside that silence, to trust his eyes more than anything else. But the fog that morning had been thick and low, rolling across the ground like slow water, and the 3 men had walked right through it, without making a shadow, until they were barely 20 feet away. Ren pressed his back against the oak tree behind him. His hand found the rough bark automatically, fingers spreading wide against it the way they always did when he needed to feel something solid. The tree was one of the oldest in the grove, a broad, scarred thing with roots that pushed up through the gray earth like the knuckles of a buried giant. He had carved his name into it twice already, once low, when he was small enough that the carving sat near the ground, once higher, when he had grown. The letters were still there, faded now, but still visible if you knew where to look. The 3 men wore travel clothes, thick boots, heavy cloaks, packs on their backs that suggested they had been walking for more than a day. They were not soldiers. He could tell that much from the way they stood, loose and uncertain, rather than straight and prepared. The tallest one had a wide face and a short beard, and he was staring at Ren with an expression that sat somewhere between surprise and unease. The second was younger, with a thin neck and wide eyes, and he kept glancing at the trees around them as if he expected the forest itself to do something. The third was the oldest of the group, a compact man with a weathered face and gray at his temples, and he was looking at Ren with something closer to curiosity. It was always the older ones who looked at him like that. The young ones just looked afraid. Ren did not move. Moving too fast tended to make things worse. He had learned that early, that stillness was a kind of language, and that if you held yourself very quiet and very still, most people would eventually decide you were harmless, and either leave or speak first. He was good at waiting. He had been waiting his whole life. The tall man with the beard cleared his throat. "Hey," he said, and his voice was rough from the cold. "We don't mean any trouble. We're just passing through." Ren nodded once. The man glanced at his companions. "We're looking for the road that comes out near Harwick Ridge. We took a wrong turn somewhere back in the fog." He paused. "Do you know it?" Ren opened his mouth, closed it. He touched his own throat with 2 fingers, a gesture he had developed years ago, simple and clear, though most people misread it the first time. He pointed at his throat and shook his head slowly. The young one with the wide eyes blinked. "He can't speak," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The older man with the gray temples took a step forward. He was watching Ren carefully, not with fear, but with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was used to paying close attention to things. "All right," he said. "Can you point?" Ren could point. He pointed southeast. "How far?" Ren held up 3 fingers, then tapped his boot, then made a walking motion with 2 fingers against his palm. 3 hours of walking. The older man seemed to understand. He nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted, not pity, which Ren had seen too many times to count, but something more like respect. "Thank you," the older man said. He looked around at the trees, at the carvings everywhere, the hundreds of letters pressed into bark at every height. "Did you do all of this?" Ren nodded. "Have you been here long?" Ren spread his arms wide. The man studied him for another moment, then gave a small nod that seemed to mean he understood more than Ren had said. He nudged his 2 companions, and the 3 of them moved on through the grove, heading southeast, disappearing back into the fog the same way they had come. Ren stood at the oak tree for a long time after they were gone. He picked up the knife from the frozen ground and turned it over in his hands, warming it. Then he pressed the tip of it against the bark above the second carving of his name, and he began again. R-E-N. The letters came out deep and clean, the bark peeling back in thin curls that fell to the ground at his feet. He worked slowly, carefully, the way he always did. He was not in a hurry. He was never in a hurry. There was nowhere he needed to be, and no one waiting for him, and the Deadlands stretched out in every direction for miles and miles, with nothing in them but old trees and broken rock, and the occasional traveler passing through on the way to somewhere else. That was fine. Ren had decided a long time ago that it was fine. He was 8 years old when his pack left him. He knew this because he had counted the winters since, and there had been 15 of them, which made him 23 now, or close enough. He did not know the exact date of his birth. His mother had never told him, and she had not been there for the leaving, which was one of the few things he was grateful for. She had gone the winter before, not walking away, but gone in the other way, the quiet way, the way that left a body behind. She had been sick for a long time before that. He had spent those months sitting with her, holding her hand, and she had spent those months looking at him with an expression that was full of something he was too young then to name. He could name it now. It was guilt. She had known what was coming. She had known that once she was gone, there would be nothing to hold the pack to him. He was the wrong kind. Too quiet, too strange, unable to do the one thing that every member of a pack was expected to do, which was communicate. He could not call out in warning. He could not respond to orders. He could not sing at celebrations, or argue at meetings, or greet newcomers, or curse at bad weather. He had no voice, and in a world built entirely around the spoken word, a person with no voice was less than useful. A person with no voice was a problem. They had not been cruel about it, which he had come to appreciate later, when he heard stories of how cruelty actually looked. They had simply left him behind when the pack moved on to new territory after the first thaw. They had left him food, a week's worth, carefully packed, and a small knife, and a blanket that was better than the one he had. The pack leader, a large, steady man whose name Ren had never heard directed at him, had crouched down to look at him and said something, but Ren had not been able to read his lips clearly in the low light of early morning. Whatever was said, it was not long. Then the man stood, and the pack walked away, and Ren sat in the place where the camp had been and watched them go until the last of them disappeared through the tree line. He had eaten the food very slowly, making it last as long as he could. He had stayed in the cleared ground of the old camp for 2 full days, not because he expected anyone to come back, but because he did not yet know where else to go. On the 3rd day, he walked. He walked for a long time. East first, then north, then turning, without quite deciding to turn, until he was moving in a slow curve that eventually brought him to the edge of the Deadlands, where the soil went gray, and the trees went thin, and the air had a particular stillness that he recognized immediately as matching the stillness inside himself. He had stopped at the first tree he reached, a scraggly, wind-bent thing with bark like cracked leather, and he had taken out the small knife and pressed it to the wood. He had not been thinking clearly about what he was doing, or why. He had been cold and frightened and very tired, and the carving was simply something his hands knew how to do. He had carved things his whole childhood, small figures, simple shapes, anything to keep his hands busy during the long silences he lived in. But what came out of the knife that day was not a figure or a shape. It was 3 letters, the only 3 letters that, at that moment, felt like they needed to exist. R-E-N. He stood back and looked at them. They were crooked. The R was too wide at the top, and the N leaned slightly to one side. But they were there, cut into the living wood, and no amount of wind or rain or time was going to make them not there. He touched them with his fingertips. Then he walked deeper into the Deadlands. He carved his name into the next tree he passed, and the one after that, and the one after that. He carved it into rocks when there were no trees. He carved it into the frozen mud of a dried-up riverbed. He carved it into the rotting wood of an old collapsed fence. He carved it everywhere, obsessively, with a single-mindedness that he could not explain and did not try to. He only knew that every tree he passed that did not have his name on it felt like a tree that did not know he existed, and he could not bear that. He could not bear the idea of passing through the world and leaving no mark on it at all. The Deadlands were not truly dead, despite the name. They were dormant. That was the difference, though few people who lived outside them understood it. The trees were old and slow, and many of them had lost most of their leaves, which gave the whole region a skeletal look that frightened travelers. The soil was pale gray rather than the rich dark brown of the farmlands to the south. The rivers and streams that had once run through the region had mostly dried up, leaving only shallow beds of pale stone and sand. But life was still there, careful, patient, stubborn life. Small birds nested in the crooks of the oldest trees. Rabbits and foxes moved through the undergrowth. Wild herbs pushed up through the gray soil every spring, low and tenacious and smelling strongly of something sharp and clean. Ren had learned all of it. He had spent years learning the Deadlands the way other people learned languages, slowly, through total immersion, making mistakes and correcting them, until the whole place was as familiar to him as the sound of his own heartbeat would have been, if he had been the kind of person who paid attention to things like that. He knew which trees were the oldest, and which were slowly dying. He knew where the herbs grew thickest in spring, and where the rabbit warrens were in autumn, and where to find clean water, even in the driest part of summer. He knew the way the light moved through the gray canopy at different times of day, and how to read the direction of wind from the way the grass bent, and which way the fog rolled in the morning versus the evening. He knew the Deadlands the way a person knows a home, not perfectly, and not without occasional surprise, but fundamentally, at a level deeper than thought. He had built himself a shelter against the side of a long limestone ridge near the center of the territory, a low, solid structure of stone and wood and packed earth that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. He had built it slowly, over the course of 2 years, adding to it piece by piece as he learned what he needed. It was not large. It did not need to be. There was only one person living in it. He had carved his name above the door. The 3 travelers would reach Harwick Ridge by afternoon, if they kept a steady pace in the right direction. He had pointed them correctly. He always did. Travelers passed through the Deadlands with some regularity, usually lost, occasionally frightened, once or twice in genuine trouble, and Ren had learned early that helping them was something he was good at. He knew the land. He could give directions. He could point to water sources, warn people away from unstable ground, indicate whether a path was passable or not. He did all of this in silence, with gestures and drawings in the dirt and occasional notes scratched onto bark or smooth stone. Most of the travelers were grateful. A few were suspicious of him. A young man alone in a dead forest, mute, carving letters into trees. He understood why. He probably looked strange to people who had never spent much time alone. People who lived in communities had a particular way of looking at those who did not, a way that mixed concern with unease, as if solitude itself were a sign that something had gone wrong. Something had gone wrong, he knew that, but it had not gone wrong recently, and he had long since stopped thinking of his life in the Deadlands as a temporary situation. This was simply where he lived. This was who he was. The mute young man with the knife and the thousands of carved names scattered across miles of gray forest. He finished the 3rd carving on the old oak and stepped back to look at it. 3 versions of himself now, at 3 different heights, climbing the bark from the ground up toward the bare branches. He sometimes thought about what someone would make of this tree if they found it long after he was gone. All those carvings, the same 3 letters over and over, each one made at a different time in a different moment of his life. Would they think it was a joke? A kind of madness? A ritual? It was none of those things. It was simply the only way he had ever found to make the world remember he was in it. He tucked the knife back into the worn leather sheath at his belt and pulled his coat tighter against the cold. The fog was beginning to lift in the east, thinning slowly the way fog always did here, burning off in layers rather than all at once. By midday it would be clear, and the pale winter light would lie flat and white across the gray soil and make the whole landscape look like something drawn in pencil, precise and stark and oddly beautiful, if you had learned how to see it. Ren had learned how to see it a long time ago. He picked up the small bundle of herbs he had been collecting before the travelers arrived and turned back toward the ridge, walking at his usual steady pace, his boots leaving clean prints in the frost-stiffened ground. Behind him, the old oak stood in the clearing with its 3 names cut into it, and the fog moved past it slowly, and the small birds that nested in its upper branches made no sound at all. He did not look back. He never looked back. What was behind him was already carved into the world. The only direction that mattered now was forward, and the forward was long, and it was gray, and it was his. The Deadlands went quiet again after he left the clearing, settling back into the particular deep silence that was its natural state, and in that silence, if you stood very still and looked closely at the trees, you would see what every traveler eventually noticed, that there was a name everywhere, in the bark of every tree, at every height, in letters that were sometimes careful and sometimes rushed, and sometimes deeply cut, and sometimes barely there. The same 3 letters, over and over and over, pushed into the living wood of an entire forgotten territory. REN. A name that no one had spoken aloud in 15 years. A name that had never been heard, only seen. A name carved into hundreds of trees by a young man who had nothing else to give the world, and everything to prove to it. It was a name that would not stay forgotten for much longer. E. The rider came in fast from the north, pushing his horse harder than the frozen ground deserved, and he did not slow down until he was inside the gates of the northern garrison, and the horse's flanks were shaking with exhaustion. He dropped from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped, threw the reins at the nearest stable hand, and walked directly to the command room, without taking off his riding cloak, or his boots, or even the frost still crusted along the edge of his collar. Lieutenant Owen Grath was reviewing supply counts when the door opened without a knock, and he looked up with the particular expression of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something important. But the rider's face stopped whatever sharp word he had been preparing to say. The man, a soldier named Cole, one of the 4 Grath had sent into the Deadlands 11 days ago, looked like someone who had walked out of a story that nobody around him would believe. "Close the door," Grath said. Cole closed the door. "Where are the others?" "Dalton and Fenn are an hour behind me." Pierce turned back at the Harwick Junction, his horse through a shoe. Cole reached into the inside pocket of his cloak and produced a roll of thin, folded paper. He set it on the table between them. "I need you to look at this before they arrive." Grath looked at the roll of paper. It was not paper, actually. It was bark, thin sheets of it, stripped carefully from trees and pressed flat, bound together with a length of rough cord. He picked it up and unrolled it slowly. Inside were impressions, charcoal rubbings made from carved tree bark, each one transferring the negative image of something cut into wood onto the surface of the flat sheet. He held the first one up to the lamp. 3 letters stared back at him. Large, carefully carved, slightly uneven. REN. He looked at the second. The same 3 letters, smaller this time, pressed into what appeared to be a different surface. The grain of the wood beneath the impression was different, finer. A different tree. He went through all of them. There were 14 sheets. 14 different trees, 14 different carvings, all of them bearing the same 3 letters. Some were old. The bark rubbings showed letters with worn edges, the carved grooves partially filled in with the weathering of years. Some were new, the letters sharp and clean, clearly made recently, and the sizes varied wildly. Some carvings were barely an inch tall, cut with a narrow blade in precise strokes. Others were large and deep, the kind of carving that took real effort, the wood cut away to a depth of half an inch or more. Grath set the last sheet down. He looked at Cole. "How many?" he said. "How many trees, or how many distinct carvings?" "Both." Cole pulled out a small notebook, the kind soldiers used for tallying supply counts, and opened it to a page dense with numbers. "We covered roughly 40 square miles of the interior. In that area, we found the carvings on 217 trees. Some trees had multiple carvings, different heights, as if the same person had returned to the same tree at different points in time. Total distinct carvings, counting each one separately, was just over 400. Grath said nothing for a moment. "The range of heights," Cole continued, "goes from about 2 feet off the ground to, in one case, on a large oak near the central ridge, about 14 feet up. The highest ones were clearly made from a position of climbing. The lowest ones, based on how worn they are, compared to the ones above them on the same trees, are older." He paused. "Whoever started this was shorter when they began." "A child," Grath said. "That's what we thought. Someone who began carving these when they were young, maybe 8, 9 years old, and has continued for years, possibly a decade or more, based on the weathering difference between the oldest and newest examples." Grath picked up the first bark sheet again and studied it. One name, over 400 times, across 40 square miles. "More than 40, Cole said quietly. "We only covered 40. The territory is larger, if the pattern holds. Then the total could be in the thousands." Grath set the sheet down again very carefully, as if it might break. "Did you find the person?" "No, but we found signs of habitation. A structure near the central limestone ridge, stone and timber, well built, clearly occupied. A fire pit with recent ash, food stores, tools." Cole hesitated. "And more carvings. On the stone of the structure itself, on a flat rock near the fire pit, on a wooden beam over the entrance. Always the same name. Always the same name." Grath stood up from the table and moved to the window. Outside, the garrison courtyard was busy with the ordinary activity of a winter morning. Soldiers moving between buildings, horses being led, someone hauling firewood across the frozen ground. Normal, ordered, everything where it was supposed to be. He watched it for a moment, and then he said, "Have you told anyone else about this?" "No, I came to you directly." "Keep it that way for now." He turned back from the window. "Dalton and Fenn, when they arrive, they are to speak to no one about what they found until I've spoken to them myself. Is that clear?" "Clear." Grath gathered the bark sheets and rolled them back together. He tied the cord carefully around them, then held them in both hands, looking at them. A thought was forming in his mind, slow and inevitable, the kind of thought that arrives not as a flash but as a weight. He had served in the Northern Territories for 11 years. He knew the Deadlands, not well, no one knew them well, but he knew their history, knew what they had been before the long decline that had left them gray and empty and avoided. He knew what the territory represented in the official records of the Alpha King's domain: unclaimed, uninhabited, economically useless, strategically irrelevant, a blank space on the map, a place that no one bothered to fight over because no one wanted it. 217 trees, 400 carvings, a stone shelter with a fire still warm in the pit. Someone had made the blank space on the map into a home. "I need to write a report," Grath said. He sat back down. "And I need to think very carefully about who I send it to." He did not send it to his immediate superior, who was a careful, unimaginative man, more concerned with supply routes than with anything as intangible as this. He sent it, after 2 days of drafting and redrafting, directly to the palace, addressed to the office of the Alpha King. He was not sure it would reach Cale himself. Reports sent to the palace rarely did, filtered as they were through layers of administrative staff and advisors. But he wanted it on record somewhere that he had found something unusual, and that the unusual thing deserved attention. He included 3 of the bark rubbings with the report. The best 3, the oldest carving, showing letters worn almost smooth by years of weather, the newest carving, sharp and recent, and the one from the stone structure, the name pressed into the wall above the entrance, which he had included, because it seemed to him the most significant. The others carved their names into trees, into things that grew and changed and eventually died. But someone had carved into stone. Stone that they had built themselves, arranged with their own hands into something meant to last. He sealed the package and sent it north. He did not expect anything to happen quickly. He expected the normal pace of bureaucratic movement, weeks, possibly months, before anyone with authority acknowledged receipt. He expected, if he was honest, that the report would be noted and filed and forgotten. The Deadlands were not important. A strange name carved into old trees was not important. Whatever lived in that stone shelter was not, by any reasonable measure, the concern of a king. He was wrong about all of it. The report reached the palace in 5 days, faster than expected, because the rider he had chosen was fast, and the roads were clear, and the early winter storms had not yet reached the southern passes. It was received by a junior administrator, who read the cover note, looked at the 3 bark rubbings, and made the judgment, correctly, as it turned out, that this was not the kind of thing to leave in a pile. He passed it to his senior, who passed it to the head of the Northern Affairs Office, who read the full report with a frown, and then sat quietly for a moment, before doing something unexpected. She brought it directly to Cale. Her name was Lyra, and she had held her position for 6 years, and in that time she had developed a particular instinct for the things that her king would want to see, and the things he would not. Most of what crossed her desk fell into the second category: routine reports, territorial counts, trade numbers, the ordinary paperwork of governing a large domain. But occasionally something crossed her desk that fell into the first category, and she had learned, after a few early mistakes in both directions, to trust that instinct without questioning it too much. The bark rubbings were in the first category. She could not have explained exactly why. There was something about the 3 sheets of pressed charcoal, about the same letters appearing in the same careful hand on 3 different surfaces across what the report described as a great many years, that made her feel certain Cale should see them. Not because they represented a threat or an opportunity or a political situation requiring management, but because they were strange, and Cale was the kind of man who paid attention to strange things. She was right about that, too. He was in the Eastern study when she came to him, reviewing trade agreements with his senior advisor, a dry and meticulous man named Aldous who had a gift for numbers and very little interest in anything else. Lyra knocked, entered when called, and laid the 3 bark sheets on the table in front of the king, without preamble. She placed Grath's report beside them. "I thought you should see this," she said. "I may be wrong." Chaol looked at the 3 bark sheets. He did not touch them immediately. He studied them first, his eyes moving slowly across each one, taking in the weathering, the depth of cut, the particular way the letters had been made. Then he looked at the report. He read it completely, including the margins where Grath had written additional notes to himself about the height variations and the estimated age of the oldest carvings. He read it without expression, in the way he read everything, carefully, with the full weight of his attention, giving no indication of what he was thinking. Aldous, across the table, watched with the barely concealed impatience of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of a column of numbers and would prefer to return to it. When Chaol finished the report, he set it down. He picked up the bark sheet with the newest carving, the one Grath had included because it was so sharp and clean, the wood still pale at the cut edges, and held it to the lamp. The letters were large and unhurried. Someone who had done this many times, someone for whom this was not an act of urgency or desperation, but simply something that was done, as naturally as breathing. "When was this report sent?" Chaol asked. "It arrived this morning. It was written 5 days ago." "And the patrol that found this, did they see the person?" "No, only the evidence of habitation." Lyra paused. "The lieutenant estimates the person has been living there for somewhere between 10 and 15 years. Chaol set the bark sheet down. He was quiet for a moment. Aldous cleared his throat. "Shall I continue, or—" "We're done for today," Chaol said, not unkindly, but with the tone of a man who has just decided something. He looked at Lyra. "I want a second patrol sent, larger this time, but instructed to observe rather than approach. I want to know how the person moves through the territory, what their routines are, what they eat. I want a complete account, not just evidence of presence." He paused. "And I want the patrol leader to be someone with the sense to know the difference between a person who is dangerous and a person who is afraid." Lyra wrote that down. "And yourself?" He was already picking up the 3 bark sheets, holding them carefully, the way you hold something that might be fragile. "I want to go there myself," he said. Aldous made a sound. "I know," Chaol said without looking at him. "It's not what my schedule allows. We'll adjust the schedule." He set the bark sheets down again. 400 carvings, the same name, for 15 years. He looked up at Lyra. Someone has been standing in a dead forest for 15 years, carving their name into every surface they could find. He paused. "I want to know why." Lyra did not say what she was thinking, which was that she already suspected she knew why, that the answer was in the bark sheets themselves, in the careful desperation of 400 identical carvings, the same 3 letters pressed into every surface available, as if the person making them was terrified of something very specific. She was terrified they would be forgotten. That was what she thought, but she said only, "Yes, sir," and gathered her notes, and left the king sitting alone, with the 3 sheets of bark on the table in front of him, each one bearing a name he did not yet know how to say, a name he had never heard, a name that existed only in silence and in carved wood. Outside the palace, the winter deepened. The roads north would be harder by the week's end. The Deadlands would be colder and quieter than ever, the frost thickening on the gray soil, the old trees standing dark against a pale sky, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a young man with a knife and no voice would be adding his name to the wood again, working carefully in the cold, the same 3 letters he had always made. Unaware that for the first time in 15 years, someone with the power to do something about it had seen his name, and had decided it was worth a journey. Back in the Deadlands, Ren was moving through the outer edge of the northern grove when he felt it, the particular shift in the air that told him something had changed. Not a sound, never a sound, but a pressure in the atmosphere, the way the light fell differently through the trees, the way the birds near the old ash tree had gone quiet all at once. He stopped walking. He stood very still and looked in the direction the stillness had come from. Nothing moved in the trees. The fog was gone by now, the afternoon light lying flat and pale across the gray ground. He waited, counting seconds in his head the way he always did when he needed to slow his own pulse down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The birds started up again somewhere to his left. a small chorus of the dark-winged birds that nested in the dying elms, the ones whose call he could feel more than hear. A low vibration that he had learned to notice in his chest and jaw, even when it did not reach his ears. 12. 13. 14. Nothing. He started walking again, slower now, his eyes moving across the ground and the tree line and the sky in the steady scan he had learned over years of living alone, in a place where the only early warning system he possessed was his own attention. He walked for another half-mile, checking the snares he had set 3 days ago. Finding 2 of them empty, and one with a rabbit he dispatched quickly and tucked into his pack. But the feeling did not leave him entirely. Something had been different in the air today. Something that was not the wind, and not the weather, and not the ordinary movement of the land around him. He could not name it. He never could, with these things. He only knew that his body was telling him something his mind had not caught up with yet. He reached the shelter by late afternoon, stacked fresh wood by the door, and spent an hour doing the small maintenance tasks that kept the place functional in winter, checking the packed earth around the base of the walls for frost damage, reinforcing a section of the roof where the weight of recent snow had pressed down on one of the horizontal beams, making sure the ventilation above the fire pit was clear. When it was done and the fire was lit and the rabbit was over it, he sat on the low bench he had built against the south wall and looked at the door. He thought about the 3 travelers that morning. He thought about the way the older one had looked at the carved names on the trees without fear, only that quiet, attentive curiosity. He thought about the way the youngest one had said, more to himself than to anyone, "He can't speak," not cruelly, but with the particular tone of someone encountering something they simply had not considered before. He thought about the bark sheet on the shelf above the fire. He had dozens of them, accumulated over years, flat pieces of stripped bark, dried and pressed, that he used for writing when he needed to communicate something more complex than pointing could manage. Most of them were worn and covered in faded notes, old messages to himself, lists of food stores, weather observations, records of which trees in the territory were weakest and might not last another hard winter. He had one clean sheet left. He looked at it. Then he looked at the door again. He had the feeling, sitting there in the firelight, with the rabbits sizzling above the coals, and the deadlands deep and still outside his walls, that something was coming. Not something bad necessarily, just something. Something that had not been here before, and was now moving in the direction of where he was. He was right. He just did not know yet how large a thing it was. Far to the north, in a stone palace with tall windows and deep fires, a king was still sitting at his table long after the dinner hour, holding a sheet of pressed bark in the lamplight, and reading the same 3 letters he had read a dozen times already, as if looking long enough might tell him something the letters themselves could not say. The fire in the palace study burned low, the night deepened, the bark sheet lay on the table, and in the deadlands, the young man with no voice sat in his shelter, watching the fire, waiting for the something that was coming. Neither of them slept well that night. The second patrol entered the deadlands on a morning so cold that their breath formed a continuous cloud around the group. 8 soldiers moving in the loose, careful formation that Lieutenant Grath had specified, spread wide enough to cover ground, close enough to stay in sight of one another. Their commanding officer was a woman named Captain Edna Wills, and she had been chosen for this assignment not because she was the most senior officer available, which she was not, but because she was known throughout the garrison for 2 things: exceptional observational skill, and the ability to keep her mouth shut about what she observed, until she had thought carefully about what it meant. Grath had briefed her the night before. He had shown her the bark rubbings, all 14 of them, spread out across the table in the order Cole had catalogued them. He had told her about the stone shelter, the warm ash in the fire pit, the food stores. He had told her what he knew, and what he did not know, and then he had said, "I need you to see the person if you can. Do not approach. Do not allow yourself to be seen if possible. I want to know what they look like, how they move, whether they appear to be in good health, whether they appear to be afraid or calm or—" He paused. "Just watch, and tell me what you see." Edna had looked at the bark rubbings for a long time before she packed them away. "The letters are very consistent," she said. "What do you mean?" "The way they're formed. Someone who's been carving the same 3 letters for 15 years develops a very specific way of making each stroke. The R, for example. Look at the curve of it. It's the same on the oldest example as it is on the newest. Same angle, same depth at the curve, Same slight hesitation in the downstroke, where the second leg begins. She traced it with her finger, not touching the bark. This person has been doing this since they were a child, and they have never once varied how they do it. That's not compulsion. That's practice. Grath looked at her. Does that tell you something? It tells me the person is careful, she said, and that whatever they're doing, they've decided exactly how to do it, and they haven't second-guessed themselves in 15 years. She paused. That's either very confident or very afraid. Maybe both. She led her patrol through the territory now with that thought still in her head, moving carefully through the gray undergrowth, stepping over exposed roots and frozen patches of ground with the practiced quiet of experienced soldiers. They had been at it for 3 hours when the youngest member of the patrol, a slight, observant young soldier named Peter, who had the best eyes in the unit, raised his hand in the slow, flat gesture that meant stop, look. Edna stopped, looked. 50 yards ahead, between 2 old birch trees, there was a figure. He was young. She could tell that even at this distance, in the winter light, through the bare branches between them. He was moving, but not quickly, not with the purposeful stride of someone going somewhere. He was moving the way a person moves when they know a place very well and are comfortable in it, pausing every few feet, bending occasionally to look at something on the ground, straightening again, turning in a slow arc. He wore a dark, heavy coat that had been repaired in several places. She could see the patches, even from here. He wore boots that were worn but solid. He had dark hair and he was tall, though his build was more lean than broad, and he carried himself with a particular quality of quietness that she noticed immediately. He stopped at a tree on the far side of the 2 birches. He reached into his coat and produced a short knife. He turned to the tree and began to carve. The 8 soldiers stood motionless. Edna watched, barely breathing. The young man carved slowly and deliberately, pausing between each letter, stepping back once to look at the result, stepping forward to continue. From this distance, she could not see the letters clearly, but she did not need to. She knew what they were. He worked for perhaps 5 minutes. When he finished, he returned the knife to his coat and pressed his hand flat against the carved wood, palm fully open, the way you might press your hand against the side of something warm. He held it there for a moment. Then he turned, and for one sharp second, Edna thought he was looking directly at her. He was not. He was looking at the trees in general, scanning, she realized, the careful, habitual scan of a person who lives alone in a large territory and has learned to check their surroundings regularly, out of pure practical necessity. His gaze moved across the area where her patrol stood, paused for a fraction of a second, moved on. She did not breathe. He walked away, moving east, disappearing between the trees. The patrol held their position for another full minute before Edna exhaled and turned to Peter. He was already sketching in the small notebook he always carried, his pencil moving quickly, capturing the figure's height and build, and the particular set of his coat against his shoulders. She looked over the sketch. It was good. Peter's drawings always were. "How old would you say?" she murmured, barely above a whisper. Peter considered. Early to mid-20s. Hard to say exactly. Health? Moved well. No limp, no favoring of any limb. Coat was patched but practical, not desperate. He paused. He knew where he was going. He wasn't wandering. No, Edna said. He was on a route. She looked at the tree where the young man had been carving, and then slowly back the way they had come, remembering every tree with fresh carvings she had noticed. He has a circuit. He walks the same ground regularly, and he carves at the same trees. She thought about this. He's adding to them, layer after layer, over years. They spent 4 more days in the Deadlands, staying well back from the shelter they located on the second day, watching its approaches from a distance. They saw the young man 4 more times, once at dawn, coming back from what appeared to be a line of snares he was checking, once in the middle of the afternoon, carrying a load of firewood from a stand of dead timber to the shelter. Once in the late afternoon light, sitting on a flat rock near the eastern edge of the limestone ridge, doing something with his hands that turned out, when Peter's eyes confirmed it through squinting at the distance, to be not carving but drawing, something on a piece of bark, with what appeared to be charcoal. And once at dusk, standing perfectly still at the very edge of the grove, looking out at the western horizon where the last of the light was going out. He stood there for a long time, not moving, just watching the sky. He did not look lonely in the way that people expect lonely to look. hunched, restless, unable to settle. He looked like someone who had made peace with their particular version of the world, and was simply watching the end of a day in it. Edna wrote down everything. She wrote until her fingers ached in the cold. On the evening of the fourth day, huddled around a small, carefully screened fire, well away from the shelter, she read back through her notes and wrote the summary she would include in her report. She wrote, "He is young, healthy, self-sufficient, and clearly in full command of the territory he inhabits. He moves with confidence and precision. He is not in distress. He does not appear to be in any danger from the territory itself. He carves the same name, the name REN, into every tree he passes, with a regularity and consistency that suggests this is as fundamental to his daily routine as eating or sleeping. He does not appear to do it out of agitation or compulsion, but out of something that looks, from the outside, more like intention." She paused there, chewing the end of her pen, and then added, "There is one additional observation I want to include that falls outside the scope of a standard patrol report, but which I believe is relevant. In 4 days of watching this person, I have not once seen him open his mouth, not to speak, not to call out, not to make any sound at all. He is mute. I believe he was born this way, or close to it. His silence is too complete and too natural to be recent. It is simply part of how he exists in the world." She paused again. She wrote, "I do not think this person is a threat to anything or anyone. I think he is simply a person who has been alone for a very long time, in a place that did not want visitors, carving the only proof of his existence he knows how to make." She folded the report and sealed it, and sent it north. It reached the palace 4 days later. It was read by Lyra first, as everything was, and she went through it with the careful attention she gave to all reports that came through Grath's office. When she finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she went to find Cale. He was in the northern courtyard, despite the cold, which was not unusual for him. He was known for thinking better outside than in, and his staff had long since stopped trying to keep him indoors when the weather turned. He was standing near the wall, looking north, in the posture of a man who has been standing still long enough that he has stopped noticing he is cold. "The second patrol report," Lyra said, and held it out to him. He took it. "Read it where he stood, in the winter courtyard light." She watched his face, and she saw what she had expected, the same thing that had happened when he first saw the bark rubbings. Not alarm, not calculation, not the particular narrowing of the eyes that meant he was planning something. Instead, something much simpler. His expression opened. It was the smallest change, a slight loosening around the eyes, a fraction of a breath released, but she had worked for this man long enough to know what it meant. He was not looking at a report anymore. He was looking at a person. He folded the report carefully when he finished it, and held it in his hand. He looked north again, over the wall, in the direction of the territory he had never visited, toward the gray forest where a young man was walking his circuit right now, probably, in the winter cold, pressing his name into wood, over and over and over, in the only way he had ever found to say, "I am here, I am here, I am here." "When can we leave?" Cale said. Lyra checked her mental calendar against the list of things she had already been quietly rearranging in the back of her mind, since the first bark rubbings arrived. 3 days, she said. "If we travel light. We'll travel light. You'll need to tell Aldous." "I know. He won't like it. He never likes anything." Cale looked down at the report in his hands. "Tell the stable master I'll need a good horse, something steady, not fast, and a small party, 4 riders at most. I don't want to go in like an army." "No," Lyra agreed. "That would be the wrong thing entirely." She went to make the arrangements, and Cale stayed in the courtyard a while longer, letting the cold settle around him, looking north at the pale winter sky above the wall. Somewhere under that sky, past the garrison and the road and the Harwick Junction and the edge of the gray forest, a young man with a knife was adding his name to the world 1 tree at a time. The king was going to go and find him, not to claim the territory, not to assess its strategic value, not because a patrol report had required a response. He was going because something in those bark rubbings and in that summary report had reached through all the layers of what he was supposed to be and touched something in him that did not have a title. He was going because 400 carvings of the same 3 letters across 15 years of a silent life in a dead forest was the kind of thing you had to see with your own eyes, or you would spend the rest of your life wondering about it. He went inside. The courtyard was very quiet after he left, and the cold moved back into the space he had been standing in, and the pale sky above the wall did not change. 3 days later, they rode out. The morning of their departure was gray and cold, which was fitting. Cale's small party consisted of himself, Lyra, and 2 soldiers she had chosen for their particular combination of competence and discretion. The soldiers were Owen and Felix, both of them experienced riders who had served in the Northern Territories before, and who were known, among their colleagues, for a shared and useful quality. They did not ask questions that were not their business to ask. They carried enough supplies for 10 days. They carried the patrol reports, the bark rubbings, a set of official maps of the Deadlands territory, and a sealed document that Cale had prepared in the palace study the night before departure, which Lyra had not read, and which he had not described to her. She had not asked. That, she supposed, was why she had kept her position for 6 years. They made good time the first day, the road north running clear and frozen under the horses' hooves, the winter countryside moving past them at the comfortable pace of experienced travelers who are not racing anywhere. Cale rode in near silence, which was normal for him on journeys. Lyra rode beside him when the road was wide enough, and behind him when it narrowed, and she spent the riding hours doing what she always did on long trips, which was organizing her thoughts about every outstanding matter that needed to be dealt with when they returned. It was a useful habit. It kept her mind occupied and her expression calm, which meant she was almost always able to present Cale, with clear thinking, at exactly the moment he needed it, rather than the muddled first draft kind of thinking that came from people who only began organizing their thoughts when the situation demanded it. She was thinking, among other things, about what happened when they found the young man. She had read both patrol reports with great care, and she had formed a picture of him that she thought was probably reasonably accurate, though she had not seen him herself. A young man, mute from birth or early childhood, alone in the Deadlands for 15 years, self-sufficient, healthy, in command of his territory, not in distress. She thought about what it would feel like to live alone for 15 years, in a silent world of your own making, with no one to speak to, and no way to speak if there had been someone. She thought about carving your name into trees, not once or twice but 400 times, each carving an act of insistence. She thought about what it meant that the person doing it was young enough that the first carvings had been made when they were approximately 8 years old. 8 years old, and already carving their name into the world. She thought about this for a long time, riding north, and by the time they reached the garrison at the end of the first day, she had come to a quiet conclusion. Whatever the Alpha King thought he was going to find when he reached the Deadlands, he was going to find something more complicated than that. The young man in the Grey Forest was not a curiosity, or a mystery, or a political situation. He was a person who had been failed, a long time ago, by everyone who should have ensured he was not alone. And he had responded to that failure the only way he knew how, by writing his name everywhere he could reach, large enough and often enough, and deeply enough, that the world would not be able to pretend he was not in it. Cale, she thought, was going to understand that the moment he saw the carvings for himself. He was not a man who failed to understand things when they were placed directly in front of him. She was right. But what she did not yet know was how completely it would change him. She did not know that yet, because they had not arrived. They had only just begun. The garrison came into view at dusk, its torches lit against the darkening sky, and the small party rode through its gates, and into the warmth and noise of the evening, and the ordinary business of soldiers at the end of a day's work. And for one more night, everything was still the same as it had always been. But the next morning, they would ride into the Grey Forest, and Cale would see the carvings, and then nothing would be quite the same as it had been before. That was the thing about trees with names carved into them. Once you had seen them, you did not stop seeing them. They stayed with you. Those 3 letters pressed into the bark of every surface that could hold them. The same name, in the same careful hand, accumulated over a decade and a half of quiet, unstoppable insistence. They stayed with you, and you started to wonder about the person who made them. And once you started wondering about that person, you found you could not stop. Cale had already found that out. He was about to find out how much further it went. Wren saw the horse first. He was high in the old birch at the western edge of the grove when the animal came into view below. A dark bay horse, well made, moving at a careful walk through the gray undergrowth as if the person riding it understood that speed was not appropriate here. Ren pressed himself against the branch he was standing on and went completely still, watching through the bare lattice of winter branches. One rider. Alone. That was the first unusual thing. Travelers who came through the Deadlands almost always came in pairs or groups. 2 merchants, 3 soldiers, a family in a wagon. A single rider was rare. A single rider moving slowly, not on the main track but through the interior of the grove, on a path that no one from outside would know about because it was not marked on any map and was only visible if you knew what signs to look for in the undergrowth. That was something else entirely. The rider stopped. He was looking at the trees around him, not up, not at the grove in general, but specifically at the nearest trunk, at the carving on it. He was close enough that Ren could see his face clearly, a broad, calm face, dark hair, a jaw that was set but not tense. He was not afraid. He was looking at the carved letters the way a person looks at something they have been thinking about for a while and are now finally seeing in person. The rider dismounted. He moved to the nearest tree and stood in front of it for a long moment, looking at the carved name. He did not touch it. He just looked. Then he moved to the next tree, and the next, walking slowly between them, his horse following at a patient distance on a loose rein, and he looked at each carving the way someone might look at paintings in a long gallery, with full attention, taking time, not rushing past. Ren watched from the birch tree and felt something strange happen in his chest. In 15 years, not a single person who had come through the Deadlands had done that. The travelers who noticed the carvings usually reacted in one of 2 ways. They looked quickly and then kept walking, or they stopped and stared with the kind of blank unease that people reserve for things they do not understand and are not sure are safe. No one had ever moved through the grove the way this rider was moving, deliberately, respectfully, as if each carved name deserved its own moment of attention. He did not come down from the tree. The rider reached the clearing at the center of the grove, the open space around the oldest oak, where the ground was free of undergrowth and the light came through the bare branches in long winter shafts. He stopped there. He looked at the oak, the tall, scarred one with the 3 carvings at 3 different heights, the oldest Ren had made, the first one crooked and childish, and the second one more careful, and the third one, the newest, clean and sure. The rider was quiet for a long time, looking at the 3 versions of the same name climbing the bark from ground to height. Then he looked up. He looked directly at the birch tree where Ren was standing. Ren did not move. He was good at that, at becoming part of a tree, at making himself part of the background the way animals did when they sensed danger and went still. He had learned it early, in the years when being seen had been something he tried to avoid, because being seen meant being asked questions he could not answer, and having to watch people's expressions go through the particular progression that ended with discomfort, or pity, or, worst of all, the specific kind of blank helplessness that meant they did not know what to do with him. The rider looked at the birch tree for a full 10 seconds. Then he looked away. He sat down on a root of the old oak, the broad, exposed root that made a natural seat on the south side of the tree, and he simply sat there, with his horse grazing behind him, and he waited. He did not look for Ren again. He did not call out or move around the grove or approach the birch. He sat on the root and waited, with a patience that told Ren, very clearly, that this person was prepared to wait for as long as it took. The cold settled in around both of them, the winter light shifting slowly as the morning moved toward noon. Ren stayed in the birch tree. His feet were cold, and his hands were colder, but he had been colder than this, and the discomfort was not the kind that made him want to move without thinking. He watched the rider from above and tried to work out what he wanted. Not anything dangerous. The rider carried no weapon that Ren could see, and his posture was completely relaxed. The posture of a man sitting on a tree root in a forest on a cold morning, who had nowhere particular to be, and was not bothered by any of this. He had a good coat. He wore riding boots that had seen real use. There was something about the quality of his stillness that suggested he had learned patience the same way Ren had. Not easily, but thoroughly, and from experience. 20 minutes passed, maybe more. The rider reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced something. He held it up slightly, not dramatically, just enough that it was visible from above. A piece of bark. A flat, pressed piece of bark, the same kind Ren used for writing. The rider turned it over in his hands once, and then he set it on the root beside him. Ren stared at it. He came down from the birch tree slowly, the way he always came down from trees. Not dropping, but climbing, hand by hand, foot by foot, checking each branch before trusting it. He reached the ground and stood for a moment, feeling the solid earth under his boots, and looked at the rider, who had not moved. Up close, the man was larger than he had appeared from above. Not heavy, but solid, with the kind of build that came from years of physical activity, rather than from size alone. He was looking at Ren with the same expression he had been wearing when he looked at the carvings. Calm, attentive, and without the particular quality of performance that Ren had learned to recognize in people who were trying to seem friendly because they wanted something specific. The rider's expression was not performing anything. He was simply looking, in the same way that Ren looked at things when he wanted to understand them. The piece of bark sat on the root between them. Ren walked forward slowly. He stopped 6 feet away, close enough to see the bark sheet clearly. On it, written in plain, even letters, were 2 words. He read them. Your name. That was all. Not a question. Not a demand. Just an acknowledgement. Those 2 words, pointing at everything in the grove around them. At the 400 carvings in the 400 trees. At the 3 versions climbing the old oak behind the rider's shoulder. Your name. Ren looked up from the bark. He looked at the rider. He touched the collar of his own coat, where his knife was tucked. He did not take it out, but he touched it, the way you touch something familiar when you are deciding whether you need it, and then he left it where it was. He reached into his own coat and found the flat piece of bark he always carried, the one with the charcoal stick wrapped in a strip of leather tucked alongside it. He crouched down on the other side of the old oak root, so the root was between them like a table, and he wrote 3 letters, because there was only one answer to 2 words. He held the bark up. R-E-N. The rider looked at it. His expression did not change. Exactly. But something in it settled. The way an expression settles when something confirms what you already thought. He reached forward and took the bark from Ren's hand, gently, and looked at the 3 letters up close. Then he took his own bark sheet and the charcoal he had kept in his pocket and wrote something. He turned it around and held it out. 1 word. Kale. Not a title. Not an introduction. Not I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories or my name is Kale, and I am here because. Just the 1 word. The same way Ren had answered. The only information that mattered. The only thing that made 2 people real to each other before anything else. Ren looked at the name on the bark. He looked at the man holding it. He was aware, in a distant and uncomplicated way, that this was unusual. He had met travelers, dozens of them, over the years, and most of the exchanges had been brief and functional. Directions, warnings, the occasional trade of something practical for something else practical. But this was not a traveler passing through who needed to know which way the road went. This was someone who had found the grove specifically, who had the bark sheet ready, who had sat on a tree root and waited with an undemanding patience for 20 minutes, because they understood that rushing was the wrong way to do this. He wrote, "How did you find this place?" Kale read it, wrote, "A patrol report, and the rubbings they took from the bark." Then, after a pause, he wrote on the same sheet, "How long have you been here?" Ren thought about this. He wrote the number, 15. "A long time," Kale wrote. Ren looked at those 3 words. He thought about all the ways they could be meant, as a statement, as a question, as a judgment. He decided, looking at the man across the route, that they were meant simply as what they said, an acknowledgement of a fact, nothing more. He wrote, "Yes." There was a pause, both of them sitting in the cold of the grove, the old oak between them with its 3 carvings, the horse grazing somewhere behind the rider. The winter light was flat and white and very clear, the way light got in the Deadlands on cold midday hours, when the fog was fully gone. Kale wrote, "Are you well?" The question landed differently than Ren expected. People asked that question sometimes. Travelers, occasionally, the ones who had some kindness in them. But it was usually a social form, a thing you said because you were supposed to, rather than because you needed the answer. This felt different. The question was short and simple, and it was written in the same plain hand as everything else the man had written, and it was sitting there on the bark sheet waiting for an answer, with the same quality of unhurried attention that the man himself seemed to carry everywhere. Ren looked at the question for a moment. He wrote, "Yes." Then, after a pause, the longest pause he had taken in the exchange so far, long enough that the charcoal stick in his hand left a small accidental mark on the edge of the bark, He wrote one more thing. No one has asked me that before. He held it up. He did not look at the man while he held it. He looked at the old oak, at the 3 carvings on it, at the oldest one near the bottom that was worn enough now to be barely there. He heard nothing, of course. He never heard anything. But he could see, from the corner of his eye, the man reading what was written. He could see the particular stillness that came over him when he finished reading it. Not surprise. Not pity. Something quieter than both. Ren lowered the bark. He looked at the man now. Cale was writing. He finished, and turned the bark around, and held it across the root. It said, "I should have asked sooner. I am sorry it took this long for someone to come." Ren read it again. The charcoal letters were the same even hand as everything else. The man wrote the way he sat and the way he waited, without excess, without performance. He meant what he wrote. Ren took the bark. He held it in his hands. He did not write anything back for a moment, and the grove was very quiet around them, and the cold was the same cold it always was, and the horse ate its way through a patch of frost-bitten grass, and the small birds in the elm moved and settled, and in all of it, Ren sat on his side of the root and looked at 5 words on a piece of bark. I should have asked sooner. No one had ever apologized to him before either. Not for leaving, not for staying away, not for the 15 years. It was such a simple thing to say, and it was so completely unexpected that he had no frame for it, no practiced response. He had prepared, over the years, for many of the things people might say to him. He had not prepared for this. He pressed the bark against his coat, over his chest, holding it there. Then he picked up the charcoal and wrote, very carefully, the first thing he had ever said to anyone that was not an answer to a question or a piece of necessary information. He wrote, I thought no one would ever notice. He held it up. The wind moved through the gray branches above them. The pale winter light lay across the clearing. Cale read it, and looked up, and met his eyes. And the long silence of 15 years cracked, not with noise. There was no noise. There was never any noise in this exchange, just 2 people and their bark sheets and the cold morning, but with something, with the specific quality of recognition that passes between 2 people who are, suddenly, no longer strangers. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It was just a man on a tree root, and a young man across from him, and a piece of bark, and the winter light in the gray forest, and a name carved into every tree in sight. And neither of them looked away. They stayed in the grove until the afternoon light began to thin. Neither of them moved to leave, and neither of them seemed to notice the cold with the same urgency they might have felt if there had been somewhere else they needed to be. The bark sheets accumulated between them, passed back and forth across the wide root of the old oak, each exchange building on the last. Cale told him about the patrol reports, not in detail, not with the formal language of official documents, but simply, a lieutenant sent men to investigate the territory. They found the carvings. The rubbings were sent to the palace. He saw them. He came. Ren read this in pieces, the bark sheet going back and forth as the explanation grew, and when he had read the whole of it, he looked at Cale, with an expression that the man seemed to read correctly, because he wrote, before Ren could ask, No one else is with me. There are 3 companions, waiting at the edge of the grove. I came in alone because it seemed like the right thing. Ren thought about this. He wrote, Why? Cale looked at the question for a moment, and then he wrote something that took longer than his previous answers. Longer to think about, Ren supposed, or longer to put in words that were the right ones. When he held the bark up, it said, Because a person who has been alone for 15 years deserves to be approached with care, not with a group of soldiers. Ren read that. He read it twice. He set the bark down on the root and looked at the old oak beside them. The 3 carvings on it were all visible from where he sat. The small, uneven letters at the bottom, the more careful ones in the middle, the clean ones at the top. 3 versions of the same 8-year-old's desperate first attempt, refined over 15 years into something steady and sure. He picked up the charcoal. He wrote, I am not dangerous. I know, Cale wrote back. That is not why I was careful. Ren looked at that answer for a long time. Then he wrote, Then why? And Cale wrote, Because you have been careful with yourself for 15 years. It seemed like you deserved the same in return. The afternoon moved around them in its slow way, the light shifting, the shadows of the bare branches lengthening across the gray ground. Ren's horse, the dark bay that Cale had ridden in on, was still grazing patiently near the edge of the clearing, unbothered by any of this. Ren did not offer Kale shelter or food. That was not because he did not want to. He had enough of both, and the shelter was warm. It was because offering those things felt like a step that needed to wait, a step that could not be taken in the same afternoon as the first meeting, as the first exchange of names across a tree root. He needed time. He needed to sit with what had happened today and let it settle before he added more to it. Kale seemed to understand this without being told, which was impressive, because Ren had never had occasion to communicate it to anyone before, and so had never worked out how to write it. But when the afternoon light reached the angle that told Ren it was 2 hours to dark, and he always knew what angle that was, he had been reading this light for 15 years. He stood up. Kale stood up too, without prompting. They looked at each other across the route. Ren wrote one final thing on the bark sheet. He wrote, "Will you come back?" He held it up and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the particular sharp uncertainty of wanting something and not knowing if he would get it. Kale did not reach for the bark and the charcoal. He simply looked at Ren, directly and clearly, with the full attention he had been giving this entire afternoon, and he nodded. Once, definitively, the kind of nod that does not leave room for maybe. Ren folded the bark sheet, the one with "Will you come back" written on it, and the one Kale had written on before it, both of them together, and put them in his coat pocket. He kept them there against his chest, next to the other one, the one that said "I should have asked sooner." He watched Kale walk his horse out of the grove, back the way he had come, into the gray undergrowth and the long winter light. He watched until the dark coat and the dark horse were gone among the trees. Then he turned back to the old oak and looked at the 3 carvings for a while. He took out his knife. He thought about carving a 4th version of his name, higher up than the 3rd, the way he sometimes did when something happened that needed marking, but he did not. Instead, he pressed the flat of his hand against the bark, over the lowest carving, the one a small, frightened 8-year-old had made on his first day in this place. He held his hand there in the cold. Then he walked home. Lyra knew something had changed the moment Kale walked out of the grove and back to where the 3 of them were waiting with the horses. She had seen him return from dozens of places, negotiations, inspections, difficult meetings with difficult people, and she had catalogued, over 6 years, the many ways his face and body and pace told her what had happened before he said a word. He came back now with a quality about him that she could not immediately name, and she spent the ride back to camp that evening trying to name it. She arrived at the word by nightfall. It was not satisfaction. That was something else, something more closed. It was not relief, though there was some of that. What she settled on, finally, was awakened. He looked like a person who had been handed something they had not known they were missing, and who was not yet sure what to do with it, but was absolutely certain they were not putting it down. He said very little over the campfire. Owen and Felix ate their food and kept the careful, companionable silence of soldiers who have learned that you do not fill quiet with noise just because you can. Lyra ate and watched the king, and the king stared into the fire and occasionally moved his hands as if he were writing something with a stick in the air, a habitual motion that she suspected he was unaware of. "How did it go?" she asked, when the food was finished and the fire was lower. "He came down from the tree," Kale said. "I wasn't sure he would." "He was in a tree?" "A birch, near the center of the grove. I think he had been there since before I entered. He must have seen me coming and gone up to watch." A pause. "Smart." Lyra thought about this. "Did you speak to him?" "We wrote, back and forth on bark sheets." He was quiet for a moment. "His name is Ren. That is what the letters stand for." He confirmed it. Another pause. "He has been here since he was 8 years old." "We knew that, approximately, from the patrol reports." Knowing approximately and hearing it confirmed are different things. He looked up from the fire. He wrote it down. 8 and 15, for the number of years since. He stopped. He counted them. He knows exactly how long he has been alone here. He has been counting. Lyra said nothing. She had learned, over the years, that there were moments when Kale was not reporting but was processing, and that the best thing she could do in those moments was stay quiet and present and let the processing happen. "He asked me if I would come back," Kale said. "Will you?" "Yes," no hesitation. "Tomorrow, if possible. And after that, regularly. Until..." He stopped himself. Until what? He looked at the fire. I haven't decided what I'm going to do about the territory yet. That is the official question, and I need to think about it carefully. There are legal and political dimensions to making any formal recognition, and the council will have opinions, and none of that is simple. He paused. But that is separate from whether I will come back. I will come back regardless of how the official question resolves. Lyra noted this. She noted the order in which he had said it. The official question second, the personal one first. She noted the word regardless. She added these to what she was building in the back of her mind, the slow accumulation of small observations that eventually formed into something she could act on. I'll need to send a message to the palace, she said. We'll be here longer than the 3 days I told Aldous. Tell him I am conducting a thorough assessment of the territory. A faint expression crossed Cale's face. He'll understand that to mean what he wants it to mean, which is probably a good thing for now. She sent the message the next morning. While she did, Cale rode back into the Deadlands. He went alone again. He had thought about bringing someone, one of the soldiers, someone to take notes or at least to be present, and had decided against it. 2 people approaching was different from 1. 1 was possible to open a door to. 2 was a crowd, and a crowd was a reason to go back up into the birch tree and stay there. He went in from the south side this time, coming in on a different approach, and he spent the ride through the outer section of the territory looking at the carvings. They were everywhere. He had known this from the reports, but knowing it from reports and seeing it in person were, as he had said to Lyra, different things. Every tree he passed had the letters. Some had them once, some had them 3 or 4 times at different heights. They varied in quality and depth. Some were shallow and faded. Some were cut so deep the letter forms cast small shadows in the morning light. All of them were the same 3 letters, made in the same hand. He thought about what it would take to make 400 carvings. Not the physical effort, though that was not nothing. He pressed his own hand against a tree as he passed it, the rough bark cold under his palm, and felt the resistance it would offer to a blade. He thought about the accumulated decision of it, day after day, tree after tree, knowing that no one would see them except the occasional lost traveler who would look at them without understanding and keep walking. Why keep going? He had been asking himself this since he first saw the rubbings, and he had the answer now. He had it, he thought, since he read the last message on the bark sheet last night. The answer was that there was no other option. You kept going, because stopping meant admitting that none of it mattered. And Ren had not been willing to admit that. Ren had spent 15 years refusing to admit that, carving his own insistence into every surface he could find. There was something in that refusal that Cale found he could not look away from. He found the grove. He found the old oak. He sat on the root, the way he had yesterday, and waited. Ren came out of the undergrowth after about 10 minutes this time, not from a tree. He was walking, carrying something, a bundle of dried herbs from the look of it, wrapped in a strip of cloth. He stopped when he saw Cale, and there was a moment, very brief, barely there, in which something moved across his face. Not surprise. He had known Cale would come back, but something like the confirmation of a thing you hoped for before you let yourself believe it. He sat down across the root. He produced the charcoal from his coat. He wrote, without preamble, "You came." "You asked me to," Cale wrote back. Ren looked at this for a moment. He wrote, "Most people don't do what they say they will." Cale considered his answer. He wrote, "That has been my experience also." They looked at each other across the root. There was something different about today. Less tension, fewer edges. Yesterday had been the first time, the cautious first time. The time when you are measuring a person, and they are measuring you, and both of you are deciding whether to trust what you see. Today was the second time. It was not easy exactly, but it was easier, in the way that a road is easier the second time you walk it because you are no longer worried about what is around the bend. Ren asked, early in the exchange, "What are you? What do you do?" Cale wrote, "I govern the Northern Territories. I make decisions about the land and the people in it, and what is done with both." Ren read this. He wrote, "You're in charge." In a manner of speaking, Cale wrote, "Then, this territory, the Deadlands, is part of the land I govern. Technically." He watched Ren read that word. Technically. He had chosen it with care. Not "this is my territory," not "you are living on my land." Technically, with all the softness and ambiguity that one word could carry. Ren wrote, "I know that. I have always known someone probably owned it on paper." He paused. He wrote, "Does it change things?" Cale thought about this. He thought about the sealed document in his coat, the one he had written in the palace study 2 nights before they left, and that he had brought with him and not yet found the right moment to produce. He thought about the council, the meetings that were waiting for him, the complicated political machinery that would need to be navigated. He thought about Lyra's quiet, noting eyes watching him across the campfire. He wrote, "I don't want it to." Ren read that. He read it with the expression of someone who is being offered something carefully and is deciding whether to take it. He wrote, "I am not asking for anything." "I know," Cale wrote. "That is not why I am here." "Then why?" Ren wrote, for the second time in 2 days. And Cale wrote back, "Because someone who has been alone for 15 years is worth more attention than anyone has given you. And because what you have done here, what you have built, and what you have written into every tree in this place, deserves to be seen by someone who has the sense to understand it." Ren sat with that answer for a long time, long enough that the herbs he had been carrying slipped from the loose bundle against his knee and had to be gathered back up, long enough that the morning light moved a full degree and the shadows shifted around them. He wrote, "I don't know what you want from me." Cale wrote, "Nothing specific. I want to understand what you have made here, and I want to know who you are, if you are willing." A pause. Ren wrote, "That is a strange thing for someone in charge of something to say." "Yes," Cale agreed, writing it plainly. "I suppose it is." Something happened then, a small thing, barely anything, almost nothing. The corner of Ren's mouth moved, not a full expression, not yet, but the beginning of one, a flicker of something that might become something else if it were given room. He looked down at the bark and wrote 3 words that he had never written to anyone before, that he had never had the occasion to write, because there had never been anyone to write them to. He wrote them now, carefully, in the same hand he used for everything, the hand that had made the same letters in the same way, on the same surfaces for 15 years. He wrote, "All right then." He held the bark up across the root. Cale read it. He did not smile exactly, but something in the set of his face became less formal, the slight loosening of a person who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been told they can set it down for a while. They stayed in the grove all morning. They wrote back and forth until the charcoal was almost gone, and both pieces of bark were covered on both sides, and Ren had to strip a fresh piece from a small dead birch near the edge of the clearing. They talked, in the way that writing is talking, and in many ways is better, because you cannot interrupt and you cannot stumble and every word is deliberate, about the territory, about the trees, about the plants and the animals and the way the seasons moved through the gray landscape. Ren told Cale things about the Deadlands that no patrol had ever noted, where the oldest root systems were, which areas flooded in spring and dried first in summer, where the soil was richest and where it was thinnest, and what that meant for anything that tried to grow there. Cale listened. He wrote questions. They were good questions, the kind that showed he was actually tracking what was being said and building on it, not just waiting for Ren to finish so he could say what he already thought. At one point Ren wrote, "You know something about land." Cale wrote, "I grew up on a small farm, before everything else." Ren looked at that. He wrote, "You don't seem like someone who grew up on a farm." "I suppose I have spent a long time not seeming like that," Cale wrote. Then, "What did I seem like?" Ren thought about it. He wrote, "Like someone who has been in charge so long, they forgot it wasn't always true." There was a pause. Cale looked at those words. Then he wrote, and this time there was no question that the corner of his own mouth moved when he did it. That is probably accurate. The grove was warmer by midday, the pale sun getting as high as it could in its winter arc, and pressing what warmth it had through the bare branches. The herbs in Ren's bundle had dried a little more since morning. The horse had moved around to the other side of the clearing and found a second patch of frost-bitten grass. Ren was not afraid anymore. That was the thing he noticed most about the afternoon, in the quiet space between exchanges where both of them were writing. The morning had still had some fear in it, not active fear, not the heart-racing kind, but the low, constant background hum of caution that he had carried for 15 years, the hum that said people are unpredictable, and you do not know what they will do, and you should always be ready to climb a tree. That hum was much quieter now. He did not know what to do with that. He was not sure it was wise to let it be quieter. But it was quieter, and that was a fact. And he had spent 15 years paying attention to facts. Before Cale left that day, he produced the sealed document from his coat. He set it on the root between them without opening it, and he wrote, "I want to show you something, but I want to explain it first. This is a document I prepared before I came here. I do not want you to look at it until you understand what it is, because it may be alarming without context, and I do not want it to undo what we have done today." Ren looked at the document and then at the bark. He wrote, "What is it?" "A formal recognition," Cale wrote, "of your presence in this territory. It does not grant or take anything. It says, in the official language of my domain, that you exist here, that your habitation is acknowledged, and that the territory is, as far as my office is concerned, yours." Ren stared at the bark sheet. He read it twice. He wrote, "Mine?" "If you want it to be," Cale wrote, "you do not have to decide now, but I want you to know that this is what I brought, and why I brought it, and that the decision is yours, not mine." Ren looked at the sealed document on the root. He looked at the grove around them, the trees with their hundreds of carvings, the old oak with its three-tiered name, the gray soil, and the bare branches, and the pale winter light. He looked at all of it, and then he looked back at the bark sheet. He wrote, "Why would you do that?" Cale picked up the charcoal. He wrote slowly, and Ren could see from the deliberateness of the strokes that he was choosing words the way you choose stones for a foundation, for what they will hold, not just for how they look. He wrote, "Because you have been here for 15 years. Because you built a shelter, and learned the land, and kept yourself alive, in a place that no one else wanted. Because you carved your name into every tree you could reach, not to claim them, but because you needed the world to know you were in it. Because all of those things deserve to be recognized, and no one has recognized them, and that is a failure that belongs to everyone except you." He stopped. He looked at what he had written. Then he added, "Below. And because the Deadlands have had one resident for 15 years, and that resident should not have to wonder every day whether someone is going to come and tell him he does not belong here." Ren read it. He read the whole thing, slowly. He did not write anything back for a long time. The charcoal stick sat loosely in his hand, and the grove was quiet around them, and the winter light was very clear and very still. He reached out and picked up the sealed document. He did not open it. He held it in both hands and looked at it, the way he had looked at the bark sheet with "I should have asked sooner" on it yesterday, with an expression that Cale had been watching very carefully, and that told him, as clearly as anything written on bark could have, that this was a person receiving something they had needed for a very long time, and were not yet certain was real. Ren put the document in his coat pocket, next to the other bark sheets, next to the ones he was collecting. He picked up the charcoal and wrote, "I will read it tonight." Cale nodded. He began to gather his things. Ren watched him rise and call the horse, and then he wrote one more thing and held it up as Cale was turning to leave. It said, "Thank you for explaining first." Cale read it. He looked at Ren across the cleared ground between them. He said nothing. Of course he said nothing. Neither of them ever said anything. All of their words were written and careful and deliberate, but his expression said something. It said that he understood, that he knew exactly what the bark sheets in Ren's coat pocket meant, and what keeping them meant, and that he did not take any of it lightly. Then he walked his horse out of the grove, and the sound of the hooves on frozen ground faded, and Ren was alone. He sat down on the root of the old oak. He put his hand in his coat pocket, and felt the edges of the sealed document. The bark sheets beside it crinkled slightly. He pressed his hand flat against all of it, feeling the shapes of them against his palm. Outside the grove, the winter afternoon settled around the Deadlands. The birds moved in the elms. The gray soil held its frost. The trees stood with their carvings, hundreds of them, the same letters repeated into permanence. Inside the grove, Ren sat on the root of the oldest oak, and felt, for the first time in 15 years, the absence of something he had not realized he had been carrying. It was not fear. It was not loneliness. It was the weight of a world that had not known his name was there. It was lighter, now. Not gone. It was not gone, and it would not be gone soon. But lighter. Enough that he could feel the difference. He sat there until the afternoon light went thin, and then he walked home. The document said what Cale had said it would say. Ren read it by firelight that night, sitting on the low bench with the single lamp casting a warm circle that did not reach the walls. The official language was dense and formal, the kind of writing that spent 20 words saying what 4 words could have said, the way important documents always did, as if the extra words were ballast against anyone questioning the weight of what was being declared. He had to go slowly, sounding out the longer terms against his understanding of their shorter equivalents. But he read it, all of it, and when he finished, he set it on his knee and looked at the fire. The document said, in the official language of the Alpha King's domain, that the territory known as the Deadlands was hereby acknowledged as inhabited, that its sole resident, identified as Ren, was recognized as its primary occupant, that his continued residence was affirmed and not subject to the standard reclamation processes that applied to uninhabited territories, that any future assessment of the territory for development or reassignment would require, as a condition, the consent and participation of its recognized resident. It was not land ownership in the legal sense. It did not transfer title, but it was something more difficult to argue with than a title. It was acknowledgement. It said, in the language of official power, that he was here, and that here had known him for a long time, and that no one could make him not here, without going through a process that included him. He sat with it for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He went to the small shelf above the fire, where he kept the things he wanted to keep close, the knife that had belonged to him since he was 8, a smooth, flat stone he had found in the first dry riverbed he ever crossed here, a dried flower from the first spring he had spent alone, which was almost too old now to be recognizable as a flower, but which still held its shape. He set the document there, among those things, the oldest things, the ones he returned to when he needed to remember what had kept him going. He slept better that night than he had in years. The third day, Cale brought someone with him. He had sent Ren a message the day before, not a bark sheet, but a written note via the soldier Owen, who had knocked at the shelter door at midday, handed Ren a folded paper, and waited politely outside while Ren read it. The note said, "I would like to bring someone tomorrow, if you are willing. Her name is Lyra. She has known about your existence since the beginning, and has been part of everything that led me here. She would not come without your agreement, and I will not bring her if you prefer not. Please tell Owen your answer." Ren had stood at the shelter door reading the note for a moment. Then he had stepped outside, into the cold, where Owen was waiting with the patient, in curious expression of a professional, and had given a single, clear nod. Owen had nodded back. He rode away. Ren went back inside. He spent part of that evening thinking about what it meant that Cale had asked. He could have brought Lyra without asking, could have simply arrived with her, explaining her presence after the fact, and Ren would have had no practical means of preventing it. But he had asked. He had sent a note. He had laid out who she was and why she had been involved, and he had made the choice of her presence Ren's decision. Ren had been making decisions about his own life for 15 years. He was very good at it. But those decisions had always been about practical things: where to build, what to eat, when to move, how to stay safe. No one had ever handed him a decision about who could enter his space. No one had ever thought it was his decision to make. Lyra was taller than he expected, with an efficient, careful way of moving that reminded him a little of the way he himself moved through the Deadlands. Nothing wasted, no gesture without purpose. She had gray at the temples of her dark hair, and a face that was accustomed to reading things quickly, and when she looked at the grove around her, she did what Cale had done on the first day. She looked at the carvings first, individually, with real attention, before she looked at anything else. She sat at a slight distance from Cale on the route, leaving the space between them for Ren, who took it with the careful caution of a person not yet accustomed to calibrating a three-way distance. She wrote simply, "I am glad to meet you. I have been thinking about you since I first saw the rubbings." Ren wrote, "What did you think?" She wrote, "I thought you were afraid of being forgotten." He read that. He looked at her. He wrote, "Was I obvious?" "No," she wrote. "I just recognize that particular kind of fear." They looked at each other across the bark. Then he wrote, "Do you have it too?" She considered this carefully before writing. "I think most people do, in one form or another. The difference is that you found a way to fight it that was entirely your own. And that is not obvious at all. That is unusual." Ren turned the bark over. He was quiet for a moment, his charcoal stick still. He wrote, "I never thought of it as fighting anything. I just thought if I kept doing it, Something would eventually be different. It is, Lyra wrote. Something is different. He looked at the grove. He looked at the 3 carvings on the old oak. He wrote, "It does not feel completely real yet." Give it time, Lyra wrote. Real things often take time to feel real. Cale, across the route, had been watching this exchange without participating, and Wren had noticed. He turned to him and wrote, "You are very quiet." Cale smiled slightly. He wrote, "I was raised to know when other people need to be heard more than I do." Lyra, reading this, wrote without looking up from her own bark, "That is the most gracious thing I have ever seen him write about himself." Cale wrote, "I am capable of gracious things." Lyra wrote, "Occasionally." Something happened in the grove then that had not happened before. Wren looked from one bark sheet to the other, reading the exchange, and then he did the thing he had started to do the day before. The beginning of the thing, the flicker, but this time it completed itself. His expression opened, and it was not a smile exactly, because it was too careful for that, too cautious, the expression of someone who had not smiled in a long time, and was not entirely sure the muscles still knew how to do it. But it was the beginning of one. It was the possibility of one. It was unmistakably the face of a person who had just discovered, in some quiet and private part of themselves, that something was funny. Lyra saw it. She did not comment on it. She simply continued writing, as if a young man who had lived alone and silent for 15 years, almost smiling in a gray winter grove, was the most natural thing in the world, and should be treated accordingly. Wren appreciated that more than he could have said, if he had been able to say things. They stayed until midday, all 3 of them around the root, with the bark sheets passing between them, and the exchange was different with 3 people. It took on a shape that 2 couldn't make, a shape where no single person was carrying the conversation alone, where Wren was not always reacting to Cale, but was sometimes reacting to Lyra, sometimes responding to something that neither of them had said directly, but that had emerged from the space between what they both wrote. He had never had a conversation with 2 people before. He had not known it worked like this. At one point, Lyra asked him about the herbs, the bundle from the day before. He explained, in pieces, on the back of a sheet that Cale had already used on one side, what each one was and what it was used for. She asked follow-up questions that were so specific, he suspected she had a background in medicine, though he did not ask directly. By the end of the exchange, she had written down more than a dozen detailed questions about the medicinal plants he had found growing in the Deadlands, and he had answered all of them, in whatever space remained on the bark. When she and Cale finally prepared to leave, she gathered the bark sheets carefully, all the ones from their exchange, and tucked them into a leather satchel she was carrying. She caught his eye over the sheets, and wrote one last thing. "May I keep these?" He nodded. She wrote, "I would like to transcribe them properly. Everything you have told me about the plants. I know people who could use this information. I would tell them where it came from." He read that last sentence twice. "I would tell them where it came from." He wrote, "You can tell them." She tucked the satchel under her arm and stood. Cale was already up, gathering his things, and they walked to the horses together in the quiet, ordinary way of people who have been in each other's company long enough to not need words for the small transitions. Wren watched them go. He sat on the root afterward for a while, looking at the old oak. He thought about the bark sheets Lyra had taken with her, the ones where his descriptions of the Deadlands plants were written in his careful hand, all the things he had learned in 15 years of paying attention to what grew here. He thought about her writing them up, transcribing them, and then telling someone where the information had come from. He had never given the world anything before. He had always been taking from it, carving into its trees, demanding it notice him. He had not thought about giving it something back. He picked up the charcoal from the ground where it had fallen and turned it in his fingers. He looked at the trees. He looked at all the carvings. He thought, maybe there are other ways to write your name into a place. He did not carve anything that afternoon. He just sat with the thought, turning it over the way he had turned the charcoal stick, examining it from different angles. It was not a comfortable thought. Exactly. It asked something of him that was bigger and stranger than what he had been doing. But it was not an unwelcome thought. By the time the light was going, he had decided something, in the quiet way that his decisions always came, not with a dramatic moment, but with the gradual accumulation of smaller understandings, until the larger one was simply obvious. He was going to write everything down, all of it, everything he knew about the Deadlands, the plants, the soil, the water, the patterns of growth and dormancy, the animals, the best approaches, and the dangerous areas, and the places where things could be made to grow, if you understood what the land needed. 15 years of knowledge, accumulated in the only way you could accumulate knowledge about a place, which was by living in it with complete attention. He was going to write it all down, on bark sheets or whatever else he could find, and he was going to give it to Lyra, and she was going to tell people where it came from, and people would know, not just that he was here, but what he had learned while he was here, what he had understood, what he had built, not in stone and timber, but in attention and patience, and 15 winters of paying close attention to a world that most people thought was dead. He went home and lit the fire, and he did not sit down. He started writing. He worked for 3 hours, through the evening, stopping only when the lamp ran low on oil and the words were getting difficult to see. He filled 4 bark sheets, both sides. He had barely started. There was so much more to say. He went to sleep that night with the feeling he always had when he found something that was exactly right. A kind of hum in his chest that was not excitement exactly, but the particular bodily satisfaction of a person who has found the thing they are supposed to be doing. He woke up early and started again. 4 days into Cale's visit, Wren asked him something he had not yet asked. He waited for a moment when Lyra was not present. She had gone to speak with Owen about something, and when it was just the two of them at the root, he wrote, "Why does this matter to you? Not the territory. Me. You could have sent someone. You didn't have to come yourself." Cale read the question, and was quiet for a moment. Wren watched him think about it. The slight stillness, the particular look of a person sorting through possible answers and deciding which one was truest. He wrote, "Because I have spent many years making decisions about people and places from documents, reports, maps, tallies. Everything comes to me as information, and I turn it into decisions. I have become good at that. But somewhere in the process of getting good at it, I lost the habit of going and seeing things for myself, of letting the real thing be what I respond to, not the summary of it." He paused. He wrote, "The rubbings were a summary. The patrol reports were a summary. I came here because I wanted the real thing, and when I found you in the tree, I understood why." Wren read this carefully. He wrote, "Why?" "Because," Cale wrote, "a summary would have said, mute young man, alone in a dead forest, carving his name into trees. That sounds like a problem that needs a solution, but the real thing was a person who knew his land better than my surveyors know anything, who had kept himself alive and well for 15 years through skill and intelligence, who had built something lasting and careful in a place everyone else had given up on, and who had done all of it, without a single person in the world acknowledging that it was remarkable." Wren sat very still, reading those words. Cale wrote, "That is not a problem that needs a solution. That is something that deserved to be seen. And I am sorry it took 15 years for someone with the means to see it to actually show up." Wren looked at the words for a long time. He looked at the old oak. He looked at the gray sky above the canopy. He wrote, "I have been angry about that. The 15 years. I have not always let myself feel how angry I was, because feeling angry at something that is not there is a very lonely thing. But I was." He held the bark up. Cale read it. He wrote back, "You are allowed to have been angry. You are allowed to still be angry. What happened to you was wrong. It was wrong from the beginning, and it was wrong for every year in between, and I cannot undo any of it. I can only make sure that what comes next is different." Wren brought the bark down. He sat with those words. He wrote, "How do you make sure?" Cale looked at that question. He wrote, "By coming back, by asking before acting, by making sure that every decision made about this place includes you, that you are not something that happens to, but someone who decides." Wren read it. He turned the bark over and looked at the blank back, and then he turned it over again. He wrote, "I have been deciding things alone for a long time." "I know," Cale wrote. "That is not going to be suddenly easy to change. I am not asking you to change it. I am only asking you to let me be, sometimes, someone you decide things alongside." Wren put the charcoal down. He looked across the route at the man who had been a stranger 5 days ago, who had sat on this route and written his name on a bark sheet and handed it across like an introduction between equals, which it had been. He picked the charcoal back up. He wrote 3 words. "All right then." The same 3 words he had written on the second day. Cale recognized them. He looked at them, and then he looked at Ren, and the same thing happened in his expression that had happened the first time. The loosening, the setting down. Lyra returned from her conversation with Owen, took one look at the two of them, and said nothing. She sat down, pulled out her bark sheet and wrote, "Did I miss something important?" Ren took her sheet and wrote, "Not yet." She read it and looked at him with her quick, reading eyes. She wrote, "But soon?" He thought about the 15 years. He thought about the bark sheets in his coat pocket, and on the shelf above the fire, and the hundreds of carvings in the trees around them. He thought about the document in among his oldest things. He thought about the 4 sheets he had covered in plant knowledge the night before, and the feeling in his chest when he wrote them. He wrote, "I think so." And in the gray winter grove, with the old oak at their backs, and the carved name watching over all of them, the 3 of them went back to their conversation, and let the afternoon happen around them, and it was, by any reasonable measure, an ordinary afternoon, in an extraordinary place. But none of them felt ordinary. Not one. The council chamber was the coldest room in the palace in winter, which no one had ever fixed, because no one who held power spent enough time sitting still in it to be bothered. The men and women who filled the long table were all in motion, gesturing, leaning forward, turning to speak to the person beside them, which kept them warm enough and gave the room the particular energy of a place where important things were being decided, or at least argued about loudly enough to feel important. Cale sat at the head of the table and let the argument run for a while before he did anything about it. He had called the council meeting for the day after his return from the Deadlands, which had surprised his staff, who were accustomed to him needing several days after any extended journey, before being ready to deal with the formal machinery of governance. He had not needed several days. He had come back from the gray forest with his thinking already done, and what he needed now was not time, but the particular kind of confrontation that cleared the air around a decision he had already made. The councillors were arguing about the Deadlands. Specifically, they were arguing about the document he had sent to the official records before the meeting, the recognition of Ren's habitation, formalized and sealed, and now part of the permanent record of the domain. 3 of the 7 councillors had already sent notes to his office expressing concern. 2 had used the word unprecedented. 1 had used the word alarming, which Cale had read with the particular expression he reserved for language that was designed to provoke rather than inform. Senior Councillor Edmund Graves was speaking now, a large, slow-moving man with white hair and the deep, carrying voice of someone who had spent decades expecting to be listened to. He was not alarmed, which was a point in his favor. He was simply convinced that what Cale had done was incorrect, and he was making his case with the methodical thoroughness that had characterized his service for the past 20 years. "The precedent concern is serious," Edmund was saying. "The Deadlands are not the only uninhabited territory in the domain. There are 3 others of comparable size, and at least 2 of them have individuals or small groups living in them, in circumstances similar to what you've described. If we establish that habitation alone creates a formal recognition right, then we open the door to claims on every piece of land in the domain that anyone has ever slept on, and we lose the ability to make strategic decisions about territorial development that the council has managed for." "Edmund," Cale said. Edmund stopped. "How many bark rubbings did you look at?" A pause. "I looked at the 3 that were submitted with the first patrol report, yes. And the 14 in the second package. I reviewed the summary." "Did you read Captain Wills's observation notes, the handwritten section at the end of her formal report?" Another pause. "I reviewed the summary," Edmund said again, with slightly less certainty. "She spent 4 days watching someone manage an entire territory alone. She noted his routes, his food sources, his maintenance of the shelter, his daily patterns. She estimated he covers between 12 and 15 miles daily during the warmer months, keeping track of the whole region. She noted that his knowledge of the territory is, in her words, as comprehensive as any professional surveyor she has encountered." Cale paused. "The summary did not include that. The summary was designed to—" "I know what summaries are designed to do. I also know what they leave out." Cale leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but in the way of someone making sure they are heard clearly. "Let me tell you what the summary does not tell you about this person. He cannot speak. He has never been able to speak. He was left alone in the Deadlands when he was 8 years old, because his inability to speak made him inconvenient to the group he had been born into. He has been there for 15 years. In that time, He has built a functioning shelter, established a sustainable food system, developed a comprehensive knowledge of the territory's ecology, including detailed information about the medicinal plants growing there that Lyra has already determined is of significant value to our northern physicians, and has maintained the health of both himself and the land around him without any outside support or assistance of any kind. He stopped. The chamber was quiet. He has also carved his name into every tree he could reach, hundreds of them. He has been doing this for 15 years. A pause. The summary does not tell you why. The summary would have you understand this as some kind of unusual behavior that might indicate instability or a concerning mental state. But when you go there and look at the carvings yourself, at the care and consistency of them, at the accumulated weight of 15 years of the same act repeated over and over, you understand something different. You understand that a person who was 8 years old and alone, and had no way to speak to the world, found the only way he could to say that he was in it, and he did it every single day for 15 years. He looked around the table. I went there because I wanted to see what the rubbings represented. I stayed because of what I found, and I issued the recognition because whatever legal and political complications it might create for territorial management, those complications are solvable. They are small complications. The alternative, which is to send officials to tell a 23-year-old man who has been doing something extraordinary in a difficult place for 15 years that he has no recognized claim to be there, is not a small complication. It is a large wrong, and I will not do a large wrong to avoid a small complication. Silence held for a moment. Councillor Mina Harward, who was the youngest at the table, and who had said nothing during the initial argument, spoke for the first time. I want to understand the precedent concern more precisely, she said. You mentioned 2 other territories with informal habitation. Can we have a report on those situations before we decide whether the recognition creates an unmanageable precedent? Because it seems to me that the existence of similar situations is an argument for addressing them systematically, not for avoiding this one. Edmund Graves looked at her. He did not look pleased, but he looked the way he always looked when someone made a point he could not immediately counter. Thoughtful, in a slightly frustrated way. That is a reasonable position, Cale said. I will ask Lyra to arrange the reports. And the specific territory, Mina continued. The Deadlands. I have read the ecological notes from the patrol summaries, and they suggest the territory has more potential for recovery than its name implies. If the recognition is to have practical meaning beyond the symbolic, if the resident is to be genuinely included in decisions about the land's future, then we should also have a more thorough assessment of what the land could become. And it seems like the person who has been living there for 15 years is the best possible starting point for that assessment. She looked at Cale. Has he expressed any views about the land's future? About what he would want it to become, or whether he would want it to change? Cale thought about the bark sheets, about the 4 sheets of plant knowledge, about what Wren had written on the first day. I thought no one would ever notice. About what he had written in the second conversation, and the third and the fourth, accumulating piece by piece into a picture of someone who had spent 15 years paying attention to a place with a thoroughness and love that most people never gave any place at all. He knows what the land is, Cale said. He has been learning it for 15 years. I don't know yet what he wants for it, because we haven't yet reached the point in our exchanges where that question fits. But I know that any decision made about that territory, without his knowledge and consent, is not a decision I will allow to stand. He paused. That is not a negotiable position. Edmund Graves made a sound that was not quite a sigh, and not quite an objection. Then we need a more formal process for including him, a way to communicate with him that is consistent and documentable. You cannot conduct the governance of a recognized territory through bark sheets and personal visits. Why not? Cale said. Edmund blinked. I am not being provocative. I am asking honestly. Why not? He communicates through written exchanges. Bark sheets happen to be his preferred medium, but he can read formal documents. He read the recognition letter without difficulty. If formal communication needs to be documented, it can be. The format is not the obstacle you are presenting it as. A pause. Unless the real obstacle is that communicating with him requires effort and attention that a standard administrative process does not, in which case I suggest we redesign the standard administrative process. Mina made a sound that might have been a suppressed agreement. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. By the end, Edmund had not changed his position entirely. He was not a man who changed positions quickly. But he had agreed to 3 things: a comprehensive assessment of the other uninhabited territories with informal residents, a formal report from Lyra on the ecological value of what Wren had documented about the Deadlands, and a review of communication processes for recognized residents who required non-standard accommodation. That last one, Cale noticed, was Mina's language, not Edmund's. He made a mental note to ensure she was given more responsibility in the coming year. He returned to his study after the meeting and found Lyra already there, organizing the bark sheet transcriptions into a document format that would be useful for the northern physicians. She looked up when he entered. "How did it go?" "Better than I expected. Edmund will require time, but he will come around." Mina surprised me. "Mina surprises people regularly," Lyra said. "She reads primary sources instead of summaries. It does things to your thinking." She paused. "I have 18 pages of plant documentation from the bark sheets. The physician at the Harwick garrison has already written to express significant interest. He says 3 of the compounds described are things they have been trying to source from the south at considerable expense, and that if they are available locally, in the quantity described, it changes their supply situation considerably." Cale sat down. "Did you tell him who provided the information?" "I told him it came from a resident of the Deadlands with 15 years of intensive study of the local ecology." She set her pen down. "He asked if he could correspond with the resident directly." Cale looked at her. "I told him I would ask," she said. "It would be Wren's decision." "Yes." Cale thought about it. A physician, writing to Wren, writing letters that would arrive at the shelter in the Grey Forest, asking questions about the plants. Wren writing back. An exchange, not of bark sheets passed across a tree root, but of actual correspondence. A thread running between the Deadlands and the world outside them that had not existed before. He thought about what Wren had written in the last days of the visit, when the initial careful distance had given way to something more open. "I have been thinking about what else I can tell people. There is so much here that no one knows about. I feel like I have been sitting on a library and not knowing anyone wanted to read it." "Write to the physician," Cale said. "Tell him that the communication process is non-standard, and that he will need to be patient, but that in principle, correspondence is possible. And tell him to be careful about the tone of his first letter. First impressions matter." "I know," Lyra said. "I mean more than the usual kind of careful." She looked at him. "I know," she said again, differently. She picked up her pen. "I will write it tonight." He nodded. He looked out the window at the winter sky, pale and flat, the same pale flat sky that would be over the Deadlands right now, over the gray trees, and the frost, and the carved names. He thought about Wren in the shelter, writing on bark sheets by lamplight. He thought about the 4 filled sheets and the feeling Wren had described, the hum of finding something exactly right. He thought about a library no one had known existed, sitting in a dead forest for 15 years. He thought, "We almost missed it." The thought sat in him heavily. He did not like it, but he let it stay, because it was important to let it stay. It was important to feel the full weight of how close the nearly missing had been, so that the lesson would hold. He was glad he had not missed it. He was glad someone had thought to send the bark rubbings north. He was glad the instinct that made Lyra bring them to him directly had been trusted. He was glad, most of all, that he had gone himself, that he had sat on a tree root on a cold morning and written his name on a piece of bark and handed it across to someone who had been waiting 15 years for someone to show up, and not made him wait any longer. He turned from the window. He had a great deal of work to do. He went to do it. The letter from the physician arrived at the Deadlands shelter on a morning in late winter, carried by the same soldier Owen, who was becoming something of a regular visitor, and who had, Wren noticed, developed the useful skill of handing over correspondence and leaving without lingering. He had been told to expect it. Cale had come back the week before the letter, his 3rd visit after returning to the palace and dealing with whatever it was that kings had to deal with, and had explained about the physician. He had been careful about how he explained it. He had said, "A physician at Harwick is interested in the plant information you have been documenting. He would like to correspond with you directly. You do not have to reply if you prefer not to. You do not have to open the letter if you prefer not to. Nothing is required." Wren had written, "What does he want to know?" "What you know," Cale had written back, which is, based on what Lyra has transcribed, considerably more than he knows himself about this particular subject. He wants to learn from you. Ren had sat with that. A physician wanting to learn from him. From Ren, the mute young man in the dead forest, the one with the knife, and the carvings, and the bark sheets. He wrote, "I have never taught anyone anything. There is a first time for everything," Kale had written, and there was something in the straightforwardness of it that Ren liked. Not encouraging in the overly warm way that people sometimes were when they were trying to convince you to do something they wanted you to do. Just matter of fact, a first time, as ordinary as that. He opened the letter. The physician's name was Arthur Clare. His letter was careful and professional, as medical letters tended to be, but there was something underneath the formal language that Ren could see if he paid attention. A real curiosity, the kind that was not performed. Arthur asked specific questions about 3 of the plants from Lyra's transcription, the conditions they required to grow, the method of preparation that Ren had found most effective, whether they grew in isolation or tended to be found near each other in the same areas. He said he would be grateful for any information Ren was willing to share, and that he understood the correspondence would take time, and that he was in no hurry. The last line said, "I am told you have been living in the Deadlands for 15 years, and have learned it thoroughly. I believe 15 years of direct attention to a single place produces a kind of knowledge that no amount of study at a distance can replicate. I look forward, with genuine respect, to learning from yours." Ren read that last line 3 times. He sat down at the bench near the fire and took out a fresh bark sheet. He picked up the charcoal. He wrote for 2 hours. He answered Arthur's 3 specific questions in full, with the kind of detail that came from having spent a season watching each plant through its complete cycle. Where it grew in relation to water and soil type, how it changed through the year, what part was useful at which time, what he had learned through trial and adjustment about its preparation. He included things Arthur had not asked about, but that he thought were relevant. He wrote clearly, in the same deliberate hand he used for everything. At the end, he wrote, "I will answer any other questions you have. I have been writing down everything I know about this territory. There is a great deal more than what was in the first transcription. If it is useful to you, you are welcome to it." He sealed the letter, which had never been done before, sealing a letter in the Deadlands, but Owen had brought him paper and wax and a small stamp for the purpose, and set it by the door for Owen to collect on his next visit. He went back to his bark sheets and his writing. Outside, the winter was moving toward its end. Ren could feel it in the particular way the cold had begun to shift in the mornings. Still sharp, but with a slightly different quality. A shallowness to it that told him the deep freeze was loosening. The oldest trees in the territory always showed it first, a slight change in the tone of the bark, as if something in them had begun to remember that they were not always bare. He had been watching this for 15 years. He knew exactly what it meant and how long it had until the first spring growth showed in the gray soil. He wrote about that too. He wrote about what happened to the Deadlands in spring, the particular way it came to life, not explosively, the way farmland did, but quietly, insistently, the way the whole territory seemed to work. Small things first, then larger things. Then, for a few weeks in late spring, something that was almost beautiful, if you had learned how to see it. He was writing about it when he realized something. He stopped. He sat with the charcoal still and looked at the bark sheet and understood what had just happened. He had been writing about the Deadlands for someone who would eventually read it, and without thinking about it at all, he had used the word beautiful. He had never written that word before in connection with this place. He had written about it in practical terms, useful terms, informational terms. He had written about what it was, and what it did, and what it could sustain, and where things grew, and why. He had not written about how it looked. He looked at the word on the bark. Beautiful. He thought about the spring mornings, the gray soil going pale green, the particular light through the ash trees before they had full leaves. He thought about the dry riverbeds that caught a little water in spring and sparkled for 2 weeks before drying again. He thought about the old oak in the grove, with the new growth at its branch tips, small and tentative, the same color as early afternoon light. He had lived inside all of it for 15 years, and he had been so focused on surviving it that he had not let himself say, even to himself, that it was beautiful. He picked up the charcoal. He wrote 2 more sentences on the bark sheet. He wrote, "I have been here long enough to see it change with every season. It is not what most people think it is when they hear the name. It is very beautiful if you know how to look at it." He sealed that sheet with the one addressed to Arthur Clare. Then he went outside. and stood in the cold and looked at the territory around him, the gray trees and the frost-stiffened ground and the pale sky, and let himself see it the way he had been seeing it for 15 years without admitting it. Beautiful. Stubbornly. Quietly. Entirely its own kind of beautiful. He stood there for a long time. When he went back inside, he felt something unfamiliar and small in his chest, something that was not quite happiness, which he had mostly given up expecting, and not quite the deep satisfaction of the writing, which he had found several weeks ago, and which was its own thing. It was something different. It was something that felt a little like being known. Not perfectly, not completely, but partially, carefully, the way things were known when two people on opposite sides of a tree root wrote back and forth for a week, and a physician asked careful questions, and a woman in a palace transcribed bark sheets with an attentive hand. Partially. The beginning of it. He had been unknown for 15 years. The beginning of known was not small. The beginning of known was enormous. He was not sure his chest was large enough for it. He wrote that evening until the lamp went out. He wrote more the next morning. He went on writing. Spring arrived in the Deadlands the way it always did, sideways, without announcement, in the form of a slight difference in the soil color near the base of the ash trees, and a change in the quality of the morning light that you would only notice if you had been paying attention to both for a long time. Wren noticed. He always noticed. He went out on the first real morning of it and walked his full circuit, checking everything, cataloging the changes with the careful thoroughness that had become, over 15 years, as natural as breathing. He had not expected to be doing the walk accompanied. Cale had come back 2 days before the spring shift, and this time, he had brought a young woman named Ada, who was an apprentice to Arthur Clare, and who had, according to the letter Arthur sent ahead of her arrival, a particular talent for botanical illustration, and a very good memory for what she observed. Arthur himself could not come. The late winter had been difficult for illness at the garrison, and he was occupied, but Ada had been briefed thoroughly, and had a list of questions that Arthur trusted her to expand on, in whatever direction the conversation opened. She was 20, small, and possessed of the kind of contained energy that showed itself not in movement, but in the precision and speed of her observations. She had brought drawing materials, good paper, not bark, and a set of charcoal sticks far superior to the ones Wren had been using. She offered him one on the first morning, and he took it, and turned it over in his hands, and felt the difference immediately. Better control, more consistent line. He looked at it, and then at Ada, who was watching him, with the straightforward, evaluative attention of a person who assesses things quickly and honestly. He liked her immediately. That surprised him. He had not expected to like someone he had not met before, not with the ease that came with meeting Ada. The ease had taken him several days with Cale, and he had never quite reached it with anyone else. But Ada moved through the Deadlands with a respect for the territory that was entirely genuine. She stepped carefully around the growth at the base of the ash trees. She did not break any of the small things she passed. She looked at the carvings without asking about them because she had clearly been told they were there, and had decided it was not her place to bring them up unless Wren did. He did bring them up, eventually. On the third day, when they were in the area around the old grove, and she was sketching the bark texture of one of the oldest carving-bearing trees, he wrote, "You can ask about them." She had looked up from the sketch. She wrote back. They were communicating through a small shared notebook that had become the standard format since Ada had been added to the group. I didn't want to presume. He wrote, "You can ask. I might not answer, but you can ask." She looked at the carvings on the tree in front of her, at the 4 or 5 versions of the same name at different heights. She wrote, "When did you first start doing it?" "First day," he wrote. "I didn't decide to. My hands just did it." She wrote, "Have you ever stopped?" "No. Though lately," he paused, thinking about how to say it. "Lately, I have been writing in other ways." He touched the notebook. "So the carving feels different now. Less urgent." She read this. She wrote, after a moment, "Do you think you'll keep doing it anyway?" He thought about that. He looked at the tree, at the layered names in the bark. He wrote, "Probably, but differently. Before I was carving because I was afraid no one would know I was here. Now I am carving because I want to remember what it felt like to need to." Ada read that twice. She did not write a response immediately. Instead, she turned her attention back to her sketchbook and drew something quickly, and then held it up for him to see. It was not the tree or the bark. It was the carvings, just the letters, isolated, rendered in clean charcoal lines that captured the exact depth and angle of each stroke, so that the sketch looked like the carved word itself, rather than a drawing of it. She had drawn it the way you draw something that you want to understand better. He looked at the sketch for a long time. He took the notebook back and wrote, "Can I keep that?" She tore it out carefully and handed it to him. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket with the bark sheets. He was accumulating a coat pocket full of things people had made or written for him, and he was aware that this was something new, that for 15 years his coat pocket had held only his own things, his own bark sheets and his knife, and the practical objects of his own making. Now it held other people's words and images too, and the weight of it was different. Cale had been spending his time with the Deadlands differently on this visit. Not in the grove, but walking the outer territory, looking at the land itself, asking Wren questions through the notebook that were specific and practical. Soil quality assessments, which areas he had noticed were recovering versus declining, what the water situation was in the dry months. He was not being a king assessing a territory. He was being a person who had grown up on a farm, asking farmers questions, and the farmers' questions were good ones. On the 4th day, he asked, "If anything could change here without changing what it is, what would you want?" Wren thought about that for most of a morning. He thought about it while Ada sketched the spring growth at the base of the ash trees, and while Cale walked to the eastern edge of the territory to look at the limestone formations, and while the pale spring light grew stronger, and the first green things pushed through the gray soil in the small places they always appeared first. He wrote, that afternoon, a long answer. The longest written answer he had given to anyone about anything. He wrote about the rivers, the dry beds that had once been water, and that he was almost certain could be water again if certain things upstream were addressed. He wrote about specific tree stands that he thought could recover if the older, diseased trees near them were removed. He wrote about 3 areas of the territory where the soil showed signs of richness under the gray surface layer, places where, if something were planted at the right time of year, it might take. He wrote about the oldest trees, the oak in the grove, 4 or 5 others, and about how they were the heart of the territory and needed to be protected specifically, because losing them would change something fundamental about the place. He wrote, "I do not want it to become farmland or managed forest. I want it to remain what it is but healthier, stronger, with the rivers running again if that is possible. I want it to still look like itself in 10 years. He wrote, "I think it can look more like itself in 10 years than it does now. I think it has been recovering slowly on its own since people stopped farming it badly 50 years ago. It just needs someone to pay attention to which parts are struggling." He paused. He wrote, "I have been paying attention for 15 years. I know which parts are struggling." Cale read all of it. He sat with the notebook open in his hands for a long time, looking at the writing, and then he looked up at the territory around them, the gray-green early spring landscape, the old trees, the pale sky. He wrote, "I want to bring a land assessment team here. People who evaluate soil and water and what can be done with both, but I want you to lead them, not guide them, lead them." Wren read that. He wrote, "I don't know what that means practically." "It means," Cale wrote, "that the assessment is driven by what you know and what you have observed. They ask you questions. They work from your understanding of the land, not from their own theories about it. The findings come from you." Wren thought about this. He wrote, "They would have to be comfortable communicating in writing. I will ensure that," Cale wrote. He wrote, "And they would have to understand that some of what I know about this place cannot be established from a few weeks of observation. Some of it took years. I will ensure they understand that too," Cale wrote. "You know things about this territory that took 15 years to learn. The assessment team will be here to document what you know, not to replace it with a shorter version." Wren put the notebook down. He looked at the territory around him, the place he had lived in, and walked, and carved his name into, and watched through every season for 15 years. The place he had called home, because there was nowhere else, and had kept calling home because, somewhere along the way, he had started to mean it. The place that was, according to the sealed document on the shelf above his fire, recognized as his. He picked up the notebook. He wrote, "All right." 2 words. He had discovered, over these weeks of correspondence, that 2 words were often enough. All right. I agree. Yes, then. The simplest words, when you had earned the right to say them simply, were the most powerful ones. The next morning, Cale and Ada had to leave for the garrison. Cale had official business that could not be further delayed, and Ada needed to take her sketches back to Arthur. They said their farewells in the grove, which had become the natural meeting and parting place, the same way that the old oak's root had become the natural place to sit. Ada handed Ren a second sketch before she left, this one of the spring growth at the ash tree base, the small bright green shapes pushing up through the gray, rendered in such detail that he could see the individual cells of the leaf surfaces. She had written at the bottom, "For your documentation." He looked at it. He had been writing words to describe what things looked like, and he had never been completely satisfied with the descriptions, because words were not always enough for visual information. This sketch would go with the written description, and together they would say what neither could alone. He wrote on the back of the sketch, quickly, before she could step away, "Will you come back?" She read it and wrote, "Arthur wants me to do the complete spring documentation. That takes most of the season." He read that. He wrote, "That is a yes." She looked at him. She wrote, "That is a yes." Cale was waiting at the edge of the grove, giving them the space to finish. He had become, Ren noticed, increasingly skilled at gauging when to step back and when to step forward, which was a quality that had probably taken years to develop in someone whose daily existence had required him to be at the center of things. He looked at Ren when Ada walked to join him, and they exchanged the look, not bark sheet words, just the look, that had become their usual parting exchange since the first visit. The look that said, "I will be back." The look that said, "I know." They rode out through the undergrowth, and Ren listened to the sound of the horses until he could no longer feel the vibration of them in the ground under his feet. Then he stood in the grove alone, the spring light warm enough today that he did not need to pull his coat close. He walked to the old oak. He stood in front of it and looked at the 3 versions of his name climbing the bark, and then at the fresh green growth at the very top of the tree. Small, perfect, brand new. The tree insisting on continuing the way the old trees always did, quietly, without drama, putting out another year's worth of leaves because that was what they did. He took out his knife. He did not carve his name. Instead, he carved something he had never carved before. It took him a while, because he was thinking about each element carefully, forming the shapes slowly. When he was done, he stepped back and looked at it. Above the 3 versions of his name, in the fresh wood of the living bark, he had carved 2 sets of initials, just below the spring growth. Not large, not as large as the 3 versions of his name, but clean and clear and real. C and L. 2 names, in the same careful hand he had been using all his life, added to the bark of the oldest tree in the territory he had spent 15 years alone in. He put the knife away. He pressed his hand against all of it, the 3 names and the 2 sets of initials, and the living wood between them, and the growing tips of the branches above. He held his hand there for a long time. Then he went back to the shelter and made a fire, and sat down at the bench and opened the notebook Ada had left him. A fresh one, a gift, full of blank pages, and he began to write. He wrote about the spring. He wrote about the ash trees and the soil and the rivers and the things that were growing where nothing had grown last year. He wrote about the particular way the light was different now than it had been in winter, warmer and more directional, and what that meant for the plants and the animals and the territory as a whole. He wrote and wrote, and the fire burned beside him, and outside the deadlands were turning slowly from gray to something else, something that did not have a simple name but that was, by any honest measure, the beginning of green. He wrote until his hand was tired, and the notebook was 15 pages fuller than it had been that morning. Then he closed it and set it on the shelf, next to the sealed document and the old knife and the smooth stone and the dried flower and the sketch Ada had made of the carvings. He looked at all of them together, the old things and the new things, the things he had kept for 15 years because they were all he had, and the things he had started keeping in the last months because people had given them to him. He had never had a collection before. He had had a survival kit. Now he had a collection. He looked at it for a while. Then he went to bed, and he slept without the particular quality of alertness that had been part of his sleep for 15 years, the low-level watchfulness of a person who knew that no one would notice if something went wrong. The watchfulness was still there, It would probably always be there, but it was quieter now. The way everything was quieter, in a way that was not absence but resolution. Outside, the Deadlands went on with the business of spring, which they did every year regardless of who was watching. This year, someone was watching. And someone else was coming back in the summer, and someone else in the fall. And in the winter someone would ride in from the north on a dark bay horse, and sit on a tree root, and pass bark sheets back and forth across the route, until the afternoon light told them both it was time to stop. The territory went on. The trees went on. And on the bark of the oldest one, surrounded by 15 years of the same name, 2 new sets of initials sat in the spring light, fresh and clean, and entirely real. C and L. Added by the same hand that had been carving the same 3 letters into the same trees for 15 years, which had now finally found something else worth adding. E. The assessment team arrived in summer, 6 people in total, and they came in a wagon that was too wide for the territory's interior paths, which Wren had predicted, and which was the first opportunity to demonstrate what Cale had meant by leading rather than guiding. He met them at the south entrance, the point where the gray soil of the territory began and the farmland road ended, and he looked at the wagon and then at the lead assessor, a steady, broad-shouldered man named George Neild, who was holding a letter of introduction that Cale had sent ahead. Wren read the letter quickly. It was brief and clear, Cale's usual style, and then he gestured for George to step to the side of the wagon. He took out the notebook. He wrote, "The wagon cannot go where we need to go. Everything on foot from here. I can arrange carrying if needed." George read this, and Wren watched his face for the reaction. Whether the man would push back, explain why the wagon was important, suggest a compromise that involved less walking. He did none of those things. He nodded, turned to his team, and organized the redistribution of equipment with the efficiency of someone who had been on enough field assessments to know that the territory always knew its own terrain better than the people arriving in a wagon. That was a good sign. Wren made a note of it in the back of his head. The summer was the best season for the work. Everything was visible. The plants in full growth, the soil patterns clear, the dry riverbeds showing their edges and depths at their most defined. Wren walked the team through the territory in the order he had planned, which was not geographic but logical, starting with the areas he considered most important to understand before anything else, which were the 3 patches of rich soil he had identified, then the old riverbed system, then the tree stands, then the areas of difficulty. He did not speak. He wrote in the notebook, and the team passed it between themselves and asked their questions, and he answered them. And after the first day, which had involved some awkward pauses while people adjusted to the pace and format of the communication, it worked smoothly. George proved to be a careful listener, or reader, as the case was, who built accurately on what Wren told him, without overstating or understating, and who had the particular quality of being able to hold a great deal of information in his head, and then ask exactly the question that would tell him what he was missing. There was one younger member of the team, a woman named Clara, who had come with strong theories about the territory's decline that she had developed before arrival. She was not wrong about the decline. The causes she identified were real, but she had not accounted for the recovery, and on the second day, when she started to explain what the territory would need to address the problems she had identified, Wren took the notebook and wrote, "Some of those things have already started to address themselves." He showed her 3 specific examples, areas where the soil recovery he had been observing for years was already underway, not because anyone had done anything, but because the land had been left alone long enough to begin its own work. Clara had a particular expression when she read that, the expression of someone who has to recalibrate a theory, which is never comfortable but which, in good thinkers, produces better thinking rather than defensiveness. She asked several questions, which Wren answered in detail, and by the end of that exchange, she had produced a revised framework that was considerably more accurate than the one she'd arrived with, and that she acknowledged openly would not have been possible without what he had shown her. He appreciated the acknowledgement. It was genuine and specific, not the vague gratitude of politeness. By the end of the first week, the team had fallen into the rhythm of the territory, which was slower and more attentive than the rhythm of formal survey work. Wren had expected to need to slow them down repeatedly. He found he only needed to do it twice, both times in areas where the instinct to measure and mark and sample was going to disturb something that should not be disturbed. After the second time, George told his team privately, Wren saw it happen, though he did not hear it, something that changed their approach, in a way that suggested he had been clear and direct about what he expected. George confirmed it in the notebook that evening. I have told them that in this territory, your judgment about what should and should not be touched takes precedence over standard procedure. They understand. Wren wrote back, "Thank you." George wrote, "It is the right call. You know things about this ground that we would need years to learn. We are here to document what you know, not to discover it independently." It was almost exactly what Cale had said. Wren suspected Cale had said it to George before the team left. The correspondence with Arthur Clare had grown, by summer, into something substantial. The physician wrote long, specific letters, and Wren wrote long, specific answers, and the letters went back and forth through Owen, with a regularity that had made Owen something of a de facto postal service for the Deadlands, which he managed with the same professional equanimity he brought to everything. Arthur's letters had become, over the months, less formal and more direct. The formal distance of his first letters had given way to the kind of writing that develops between two people who have been exchanging detailed information about a shared subject for long enough that the subject itself has created its own familiarity. In late spring, Arthur had written, "I want to ask you something that is not strictly professional. If it is out of place, you do not have to answer." He had then described his own situation, a man who had chosen a remote posting for reasons he did not explain in detail, but which were present in the way he wrote about the garrison, about the people there, about the long winters, and had asked whether Wren found that the solitude was something he had chosen, or something that had happened to him. Wren had sat with that question for 2 days before answering. He had written, "Finally, both. It started as something that happened to me. It became something I chose, when I understood I could leave, and did not want to. But I am not sure the line between those two things is as clear as the question makes it sound." Arthur had written back, "I think that is the most accurate description of solitude I have ever read." They had not directly addressed it again, but something in the tone of Arthur's subsequent letters had shifted slightly, as if the exchange had resolved something for him, the way the spring morning in the Grove moment had resolved something for Wren. Not a solution, but a clarification. The difference between a question you are afraid to examine and one you have looked at clearly and can now carry, without it weighing you down the same way. The assessment team finished their work in the middle of summer and prepared to leave. On the last evening, George asked Wren, through the notebook, at the campfire they had made at the edge of the territory, if he could speak about what the team would recommend. Wren indicated yes. George wrote, "We are going to recommend a river restoration project for the 3 main dry bed sections. The upstream issues are addressable. There is a blocked channel that we believe is the primary cause of the drying, and clearing it should restore flow within 2 to 3 seasons. We are also going to recommend protective designation for the old tree stands, which will prevent any future assessment from treating them as resource timber." He paused. He wrote, "We are also going to recommend that the formal assessment of this territory, for any future purposes, begins with consultation with you, as the recognized resident, with the most comprehensive existing knowledge of the land, not as a courtesy, but as a formal requirement." Wren read this. He wrote, "The river restoration. Will it change what the territory looks like?" George wrote, "It will change the sound of it, and the growth along the river margins. But the character of the land, what makes it itself, no. We are recommending restoration in the direction of what it was, not conversion to something new." Wren thought about the dry riverbeds, the pale stone and sand he had walked along for 15 years. He thought about water in them. He thought about what the margins would look like in spring if there were water to draw roots toward. He wrote, "I think I would like to hear it." George read that. He wrote, "I think it will be worth hearing." They said their farewells in the morning, the team loading their equipment and their notebooks, full ones, all of them, dense with documentation, onto the horses and the cart at the south entrance. George shook Wren's hand before he mounted. He said, out loud, which was unusual, and which Wren could read clearly from his lips, "You did a remarkable thing here. Over a long time. I want you to know that the report will reflect that." Wren looked at the man's face. He nodded once, the way he nodded, when he meant more than a gesture could say. The team rode away. Wren stood at the south entrance and watched them until the sound of the cart was gone, and then he turned back to the territory. His territory, warm and green in the summer light, alive with the particular life of a place that had been recovering slowly and quietly for 50 years, and was now, for the first time, being understood. He walked north, toward the grove, following the path he had walked thousands of times. Along the way he pressed his hand against the bark of the trees he passed, the way he always did, feeling the roughness of the carved letters under his palm. His name, repeated and repeated and repeated, the accumulated insistence of 15 years. He reached the grove. He sat on the root of the old oak. He looked at the bark above him, the 3 carvings, and above them the 2 sets of initials he had added in the spring. He looked at the summer growth at the top of the tree, fuller now than in the spring, the branches dense with leaves that were alive and real, and connected to roots that went down deep into the gray soil of the dead lands. He took out the notebook. He turned to a fresh page. He wrote, not to anyone in particular, not to Cale or Lyra or Arthur or Ada or George or Clara, but simply because the words were there. This is what it feels like when the world finally notices you are in it. It is not loud. It is not sudden. It is more like what happens when you have been standing in the dark for a long time, and the light does not come all at once, but begins to show at the edges first. And then the edges become larger, and you realize that you have been slowly becoming visible, without being able to identify the moment when it started. He sat with those words. He wrote, I do not know what comes next. I have never been able to think very far ahead, because the thinking was always too uncertain to be useful. But I think that what is coming will be different from what has been, and I think I am ready for it to be different. I have been ready for a while. I just did not know there was anything to be ready for. The summer afternoon settled around him. The grove was warm and green. The old oak stood with its roots spread wide in the gray soil, old enough to have seen many things, patient enough to have waited for all of them. Wren sat on the root and wrote, and the afternoon passed around him, and he was not alone. Not completely alone, for the first time in 15 years. The difference between completely alone and not completely alone was, he had discovered, very large. Larger than he had expected. You might think, if you had not experienced it, that the change from completely alone to not completely alone would be subtle, that after long enough, you would be so accustomed to your solitude that any small breach in it would barely register. But that was not how it worked. The difference was immense. It reached back into the 15 years retroactively, making them feel simultaneously longer and less wasted. He had been alone for all of them. He was not alone anymore. Both things were true. Both things mattered. He finished writing in the late afternoon and closed the notebook and sat for a while without writing anything. Then he picked up the charcoal, not the notebook, and turned to the bark of the old oak. He looked at the 3 versions of his name and the 2 sets of initials and the green leaves above. He carved one more thing, not his name this time, not a set of initials. He carved the number of years, 15. Just the number, small and clean, tucked between the 2nd and 3rd versions of his name. A record. Not of suffering, not that, though suffering had been part of it. A record of persistence, of the specific, unglamorous, daily persistence of a person who had decided that existing was worth proving, and had spent 15 years proving it one carved letter at a time. He stepped back. He looked at all of it. The whole tree. All of it together. He put the knife away. He pressed his hand flat against the bark, over all of it, and he held it there, and he felt the living wood under his palm, warm from the summer sun, the carvings rough against the lines of his hand. He felt the tree breathing, in the way that trees breathe, slow and deep and much older than any single season. He stayed like that for a long time, not saying anything, not needing to, not for the first time in his life, not needing to carve anything, or write anything, or prove anything. Just being there, just being in the place he had chosen, with his hand on the oldest tree in it, with the summer light coming through the leaves above, and the gray soil below, and the whole territory stretching out around him, changed and changing, and still, at its core, entirely itself, still his. 3 days after the assessment team left, a new letter arrived from Arthur. It was longer than usual, and it came with a package, carefully wrapped, tied with cord. Owen handed them over at the shelter door with his customary efficiency and rode away. Wren brought both inside and set them on the bench. He opened the letter first. Arthur had written, I am sending you something that I hope is useful. I have been reviewing the full documentation from Lyra's transcription, the letters you have written me, and the additional notes from Ada's spring visits, and I have had it all compiled properly, set in order, annotated, produced in a clean document. I am sending you one copy. There are 3 others, one for my physician's reference, one for the garrison library, and one that Lyra has placed in the palace archive. He opened the package. It was a bound document, properly bound, with a cover of stiff leather, the pages inside clean and even. On the cover, in a careful printed hand that was not Arthur's and was not Lyra's, someone at the palace probably, someone employed for this kind of work, it said, "On the natural history of the Deadlands territory, a comprehensive account of flora, fauna, soil, water, and seasonal patterns, compiled from the observations and research of the territory's resident." Below that, in smaller letters, his name. Just his name. 3 letters. Wren. He sat down heavily on the bench, not because his legs were weak, they were not, but because the weight of the object in his hands required sitting. He held the bound document on his knees and looked at the cover, at his name on it, at the letters he had carved into hundreds of trees, now pressed into something that would last in a completely different way, not into wood, not into the ground of the territory, but into a form that could be carried and read and kept anywhere. He thought about the 8-year-old who had carved the first letters in the bark of a scraggly wind-bent tree on the first day he had been truly alone, the letters crooked and desperate and barely legible. He thought about the 15 years of the same letters, accumulated into hundreds. He thought about what it had meant then. I am here. I am here. Please know I am here. And what it meant now. He opened the document to the first page. The first line was not his writing. It was a short introduction, written by Arthur, that said, "The following account represents 15 years of sustained, attentive observation of a living territory by its sole resident. No comparable account of the Deadlands exists. The information contained here corrects long-standing misconceptions about the territory's condition and viability, and establishes a foundation for any future efforts to understand or restore it." The second paragraph said, "This account was not commissioned. It was not produced in response to any formal request or requirement. It was produced because the person who created it spent 15 years learning a place that no one else was paying attention to, and chose, when given the opportunity to share what they had learned, to do so freely and completely. That quality of attention and generosity is itself notable, and this document should be understood in that light." Wren read both paragraphs twice. He read the word generosity and held it in his mind for a while. He had not thought of the writing as generous. He had thought of it as the thing he wanted to do, the thing that felt like giving the world something, instead of only demanding that it see him. He had not known there was a word for what it was until Arthur used it. His own words, transcribed in the clean hand of the palace copyist, set in clean lines with enough space between them for easy reading. The territory laid out in language, all of it. Everything he had spent 15 years accumulating. He read a page, and then another, and the feeling in his chest was something he could not name precisely. It was not pride, exactly. It was more like recognition, like meeting himself in a form he had not seen before. He read for an hour. He had to stop then, not because he was done, but because there was too much in him to keep going in a straight line. He closed the document. He held it against his chest, the way he had held the bark sheets and the sealed recognition letter and Ada's sketch. He went outside. The summer evening was still and warm, the light going gold at the edges, the territory spread out around him in the last hour of full daylight. He walked to the grove, not hurrying, just walking, and he stood in front of the old oak. He looked at everything on it, the 3 names, the initials, the number. He reached up and pressed his palm against the bark above all of it, above the highest carving, against the bare living wood that had never been carved on. He held his hand there. He thought, I did it. Not just survived, not just persisted. He had done something. He had learned something that was worth knowing, and he had written it down, and it was now in a library, and in a physician's reference, and in a palace archive, and it had his name on it. His name, printed on the cover of a real document, in a form that people could hold in their hands and read anywhere, a form that would last long after the bark carvings had weathered away. He had written himself into the world in a way that was going to stay. He took his hand down from the bark. He looked at it, his palm, the lines of it, the calluses at the base of his fingers from years of tool work and carving. An ordinary hand, the hand that had made all of it. He walked home in the gold evening light and made a fire and cooked his food and sat at the bench with the bound document open on his knee, and went on reading. And the fire went on burning beside him, and the territory went on existing around him in all its gray-green summer complexity, changed, and still changing, and entirely, stubbornly, beautifully alive. He fell asleep with the document still open on his knee, the lamp burning low, the fire down to coals. He dreamed, which he rarely did, or rarely remembered doing. He dreamed about the river, the dry bed, the pale stone and sand, and in the dream there was water in it. Not a flood, not a dramatic rushing, just water, the way water is when it is where it belongs, quiet and moving, and entirely ordinary, catching the light, carrying small things downstream, making the margins green. He woke up in the early morning, in the pale hour before the light was full, and he sat with the dream for a moment before it faded, holding its particular quality of rightness. Then he got up and stoked the fire and made something to eat, and sat at the bench. He opened the notebook to a new page. He wrote, "Today I am going to start the second volume." He paused. He looked at the line. He thought about everything he had not yet written about, the things that needed more time to describe properly, the observations that were still incomplete, the parts of the territory he had not yet fully mapped in language. He thought about what the assessment team had asked him that he had not been able to answer fully, not because he did not know the answer, but because the answer needed more than a week of walking together to convey. He thought about the rivers and what they would be like in 3 seasons, if the recommendation was approved and the channel was cleared. He thought about writing what the territory was after the water came back. He thought about what it might become. He wrote, "There is more to say. There is always more to say." He put the pen down and picked up the notebook properly, settling it on his knee, and he began. The water came back in spring, 2 years after the assessment. Wren heard about the channel clearing before it happened. Owen delivered a letter from George Neild explaining the timeline, and Cale wrote separately to say that the work had been approved and would be done in early spring so that the first flows would come before the dry season. He had been expecting it. He had been thinking about it all winter, building a picture in his mind of what it would look like and planning how to document the transition properly. He had 2 notebooks ready, fresh and full of clean pages, but expecting something and experiencing it turned out, once again, to be very different. He was in the eastern section of the territory on the morning the water arrived, checking on a group of young ash trees that had come through the winter well. He felt it before he saw it, a change in the quality of the air, a particular coolness, moving from the north, that was not the usual winter lingering coolness, but something fresh and different. He stopped walking. He turned north. He crossed the 2 miles between the ash stand and the nearest of the 3 dry riverbeds, faster than he usually moved, not running but close to it, pushing through the undergrowth with the focused urgency of someone who has been waiting for something and has suddenly understood, it is here. He heard it before he reached it. He stopped dead in the undergrowth when the vibration reached him, not through his ears, not exactly, but through his feet, through the ground, a low, persistent trembling that was entirely unlike anything he had felt in this territory before. He stood very still, his boots pressed flat to the gray soil, and felt the vibration and understood what it was. He walked the last 100 yards and came out at the bank of the old riverbed. Water. Not a flood, not a crash of water, not anything dramatic. Just water, exactly as it had been in the dream, quiet and moving, the ordinary way water is when it is where it belongs, running in a clean line down the pale stone and sand of the old bed, carrying no particular urgency, making no particular sound that he could hear, but present, there, real. He stood at the bank and looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down on the bank, with his legs hanging over, and he put both hands in the water. It was very cold, snowmelt from upstream, the first of the year. He held his hands in it and felt it moving past his fingers, cool and continuous, and entirely indifferent to him in the way that natural things are indifferent, which is not the same as not mattering. He stayed there for a long time. He was not writing anything. He was not carving anything. He was not even thinking in language, exactly. He was just there, with his hands in the water, in the territory he had spent 17 years paying attention to, watching the thing he had been watching the absence of for all of that time finally be present. After a while he took his hands out and dried them on his coat and got out the notebook. He wrote a single sentence, "The water is back." He looked at the sentence. He wrote below it, "I was right. It could come back." He looked at those two sentences for a moment. Then he added, "Everything I told them about the soil and the growth patterns near the bed, I need to check all of it again now. Everything changes when there is water." He spent the rest of the day walking the 3 riverbeds. All 3 had flow now, at different rates, the main channel running strongest, and the 2 branches running lighter, as he had predicted they would. He took notes on everything. He filled 6 pages. He was already planning what Ada would need to sketch when she came in summer, and what questions Arthur would want answered about the effects on the plants along the margins, and what the assessment team's follow-up report would need from him to document the transition properly. He was, he realized, busy. Not the survival busy of his early years in the territory, the constant pressure of food and shelter and weather, and the basic maintenance of staying alive. That business was still there, but it was layered now with something else. The work of being in correspondence with the world outside the territory, of being the source of information that people were actually using, of being part of a set of relationships that had ongoing needs and ongoing exchanges. Arthur's latest letter had 6 specific questions. George wanted a seasonal update for the follow-up assessment. Ada had asked whether the late spring wildflower distribution had shifted since the previous year, because she was tracking it across 2 seasons, and needed the 3rd point. Cale wanted to know, in the last letter, which had been more personal than his usual careful official tone, how Wren was doing. Not the territory. Wren. He wrote back to all of them. He wrote carefully and fully, because that was how he wrote. He had discovered that being the primary source of knowledge about a place that people were paying attention to was demanding in a way that was entirely different from the demands of survival, but was not easier. It was better. It was the kind of demanding that left him tired at the end of a long writing day, in the way that good physical work left him tired, a tiredness that was evidence of having done something real. Cale came in autumn of that year, and it was the longest visit he had made, 11 days. He brought Owen and Felix, as usual, but he also brought someone new, a young man named Peter, who was a junior administrator in Cale's office and who had apparently been the one responsible for commissioning the official transcription and binding of the natural history document the previous year. Peter was quiet and organized and possessed of the particular quality that Lyra also had, of understanding the logistics of a situation without needing it explained to him. He spent his time during the visit not in the grove or in the territory proper, but in the shelter, with Wren's permission, organizing the growing collection of bark sheets and notebooks and correspondence into a proper archive, categorized, dated, arranged in an order that would make future reference possible. Wren watched this happening and felt something complex about it. He was glad the material was being organized. He had been aware for some time that the collection was growing faster than his ability to keep track of all of it, and that some of the older bark sheets were fragile, in a way that suggested they would not survive another winter. But he was also aware of what it meant to watch someone else organize the record of his 15 years. It was his record. It was also, now, more than his record. He wrote to Peter on the 3rd day, "There are some sheets that I would like to keep here. Not copies. The originals." Peter wrote back immediately, "Of course. You decide which ones. I will work around them." Wren went through the collection with Peter that afternoon, indicating which bark sheets were to be kept in the shelter, and which could go into the portable archive that Peter was building. It was not a straightforward process. Some of the sheets contained information that was important to the written record, but that he also needed to keep close. Others had writing on them that was less about information and more about something else, and those he kept without needing to explain why. In the end, the things he kept were the original recognition letter, the first bark sheet from the first exchange with Cale, the one that said your name, the bark sheets from the 2nd day, that included, "I should have asked sooner," and "all right then," the letter from Arthur that used the word generous, Ada's sketch of the carvings, and the bound natural history document with his name on the cover. He arranged these on the shelf above the fire, next to the oldest things, the knife and the stone and the dried flower, old things and new things together, the record of a life before and a life after. Peter looked at the arrangement when Wren had finished and did not comment on the content, but he wrote in the notebook, "I will make sure the archive is labeled clearly, so anyone consulting it in future knows that some original materials remain with the resident." Wren wrote, "Thank you." Peter wrote, "It is your archive. We are just helping to take care of it." On the 7th day, Cale and Wren walked the river together, all 3 channels, in the autumn light that was the best light in the Deadlands, low and golden, different from the flat white of winter and the warm green of summer, with a particular quality of clarity that showed every detail of the territory at its most exact. The margins of the channels were already different from what they had been in spring, green things growing where nothing had grown before, the pale stone of the bed, visible only in the deepest parts of the channel now, the rest covered in a thin skin of new growth that was still fragile but real. Wren wrote in the notebook as they walked, "The margin growth is 6 weeks ahead of where I predicted it would be by this point." Cale wrote, "Is that good?" "Yes," Wren wrote. "It means the soil along the channels was more ready than I thought, less depleted. The recovery will be faster than I estimated." Cale wrote, "Did you get the timeline wrong, or did the land?" Wren thought about this. He wrote, "I got it wrong. I underestimated what 15 years of slow recovery had accomplished before the water came back. I was measuring from the surface, and the surface had not caught up with what was happening underneath." He paused. He wrote, "That happens sometimes. The visible evidence of a thing lags behind the thing itself." Cale stopped walking. He looked at that. He wrote, "Are we still talking about the land?" Wren looked at him. He considered the question. He wrote, "Mostly." Cale read "mostly" and turned to look out at the river channel, at the new green along its margins, at the old dead-looking trees beyond it that were, if you knew what to look for, showing the beginning of next year's growth, already at the branch tips. He stood like that for a moment, and Wren stood beside him and looked at the same things. Then Cale wrote, "Are you all right? I mean it as a genuine question, not a social one." Wren took the notebook. He stood with it in his hands, and looked at the river, and thought about the answer with the same care he gave to everything, and he wrote, "I am better than I expected to be. I thought that getting what I needed would feel different from this. I thought it would feel resolved, the way a thing feels resolved when it ends. But it does not feel like an ending. It feels like something that has been going in one direction for a long time, and is now going in a different one, still moving, just differently." He wrote, "I am not sure I know how to be all right in the ordinary sense. I have been not all right for a very long time, and I know how to do that. This is new." He wrote, "But I think that is fine. I think new is fine." Cale read it. He did not write a response immediately. He simply stood at the riverbank in the autumn light, and Wren stood beside him, and for a while neither of them wrote anything, and the river moved past them in its quiet, continuous way, and the territory held them both in its ordinary, indifferent embrace. Wren wrote one more thing. He wrote, "I carved something in the spring, above the 3 names and the initials. I want to show you." They walked to the grove. Cale looked at the oak tree, at everything on it, as he always did when he came to the grove. He looked at the 3 versions of the name, the initials, the number. He looked at what Wren had carved in the spring, above all of it, in a space of bark that had been bare until then. It was a small carving, simpler than the letters, 2 shapes, side by side, each one a simple representation that was unmistakable when you knew what you were looking at. A tree. And beside it, slightly smaller, another tree. The second tree's roots connected to the first's at the base, not the same tree, but connected, growing near each other, growing from the same ground. Cale looked at it for a long time. He wrote in the notebook, "When did you carve this?" "First week of spring," Wren wrote, "after the assessment team left, and before the river came back. I needed to carve something that was not my name." Cale looked at the 2 trees on the bark. He wrote, "What are they?" Wren looked at the carving. He looked at the old oak's roots in the gray soil, the great spread of them, the way they had been there for decades, and would be there long after anything currently living in the territory was gone. He wrote, "The territory, and the rest of the world, remembering it exists." Cale read that. He set the notebook down on the root and stood in front of the oak and looked at everything on it, the 15-year accumulation, the initials, the number, the 2 trees. He reached up and pressed his hand flat against the bark, over the 2 trees. The gesture was so similar to the one Wren made every time he stood at this tree, that Wren stood very still, watching it, and felt something in his chest that was wide and complicated and did not have a name. After a moment, Cale lowered his hand. He picked up the notebook. He wrote 3 words. "Thank you for this." Wren read them. He looked at the man who had ridden into the gray forest on a cold morning and sat on a tree root and handed across a piece of bark with a name on it, and who had come back, and had brought other people back, and who had sat in this grove with Ren, and passed bark sheets back and forth, until the bark sheets became notebooks, and the notebooks became letters, and the letters became an archive, and the archive became a bound document with a name on the cover. He wrote, "You made it possible." Cale wrote, "You made it. I only noticed." Ren looked at that. He looked at the grove around them, at the trees with their carvings, at the gray soil that was not only gray anymore now that the roots along the river margins were pulling green things up through it, at the pale winter sky coming in above the canopy, at the old oak with its 3 names and its number and its 2 trees and its initials. He wrote, "Noticing was enough." He looked at what he had written and then wrote one more line. Noticing was more than enough. It was everything. Cale read it. They sat on the root of the old oak together, in the late autumn afternoon, and they were quiet for a while. Not the uncomfortable quiet of 2 people who do not know what to say, the other kind, the kind that comes when everything that needed to be said has been said, and what remains is simply being present in the same place at the same time, which is, when you have the right company, enough. The territory went on around them. The river moved somewhere to the east, the birds moved in the elms, the gray soil held the roots of 100 trees, and the trees held the sky, and in the bark of every one of them, in the rough wood of every surface that could hold a blade's impression, the same 3 letters pressed deep into the living world. A name, 15 years of the same name, made in the same hand, cut into the same wood in the same gray forest, by a young man who had needed the world to know he was in it. The world knew now. The world knew, and had sent people to see, and had written it down, and had put it in an archive, and had carved channels so the river came back, and was going to come back again next year, and the year after, and was sitting right now on a tree root in the last light of an autumn afternoon, not saying anything at all. Ren pressed his palm against the bark of the old oak one more time, his hand over everything on it, over all of it, over the whole long record of a life that had been, against all reasonable expectation, worth keeping. He held it there. The light went out slowly, the way it always did in this place, the way it always had, not all at once, but layer by layer, the way fog burned off in reverse, the darkness coming up from the ground while the sky stayed pale a little longer. He took his hand down. He looked at the territory around him in the last of the light, the gray-green land, the bare branches, the river somewhere beyond the tree line making its quiet way through the old stone bed for only the second autumn of its return, and he felt it all. All of it, the 15 years of it, and the new ones. The alone years, and the not quite alone anymore years. The carvings and the notebooks, and the letters, and the document on the shelf at home. The bark sheets in his coat pocket, and the ones in the archive, and the ones he had not yet written. All the seasons of writing still to come. He felt all of it. And then he looked at the man sitting on the root beside him in the last of the light, and he did not write anything. He did not carve anything. He did not make any gesture, or produce any bark sheet, or reach for the notebook. He simply looked, in the way that you look at something when you are allowing yourself to know that it is real. Then he stood up from the root, and Cale stood up beside him, and the 2 of them walked out of the grove together in the dark that was not completely dark, because the sky still held some light, and the territory still held the sound of the river, and somewhere in the gray branches of the old elm by the eastern path, the small dark birds were settling for the night, making a low sound that Ren could feel in his jaw and his chest. He could feel it. He had always been able to feel it. That had never changed. That was never going to change. And now, finally, after a very long time, it was not the only thing he had. He walked home. Years later, long after the rivers ran full and the margins turned green, and the gray soil learned what it was to be tended again, travelers crossing the territory that was no longer called the Dead Lands would find old carvings on the ancient bark, hundreds of them, going back decades, the same letters cut deep into the same surfaces over and over, worn now to smoothness by years of weather, barely legible in some places, completely clear in others depending on how deeply they had been cut. Children were told the story. Historians wrote about it. The bound document, in its multiple copies, was referenced by everyone who studied the territory's recovery, cited in papers and reports. recommended to anyone who wanted to understand what attention and care could produce, from a place that had been written off as finished. And in the grove at the center of the territory, the old oak still stood with everything on it, the 3 names at 3 heights, the initials, the number, the 2 trees, and above all of it, in the living wood, the marks of many seasons of new growth. The tree went on. The carving stayed. In the territory's official registry, filed in the palace archive next to the bound natural history document, and the formal recognition letter, and the first bark rubbings from the very beginning, there was a record of the territory's name change. Approved in the 3rd year after the Rivers came back, the change had been, according to the official notes, straightforward. No significant opposition. A short council discussion. A simple vote. The name was changed because the territory was no longer dead. It had not been dead for a long time. It had been, the entire time, stubbornly and quietly and entirely alive. The new name was not the territory's old historical name, the name it had been given by the farmers before the farming failed. It was not a geographic description, or a landmark reference, or a political designation. It was 3 letters. Just 3 letters. The same 3 letters that had been pressed into the bark of every tree in the place, for 17 years, by a young man with a knife, and no voice, and everything to prove. The Wren territories. On the official maps, in the official records, in the letters that came and went, between the territory and the palace, and the garrison, and the physician's practice, and the many other places that had, one by one, come to know the place existed, the Wren territories. A name that had started in the bark of a tree and ended up on a map, a name that had been carved 400 times into a silent forest by someone who was afraid the world would not know he was there. The world knew. It had learned the name the same way Wren had written it, slowly, one impression at a time, accumulated over years, until it was simply known, simply part of the record, simply there. As he had always been, as he would always be, simply there.